Hello everyone, I am the Storyteller Daily. Today, I bring you stories that may help you drift into sleep. Before we begin, please remember to like and subscribe so you won't miss the next stories. Leave a comment to tell me, where are you watching from and at what time? Now, sit back, relax, and step into the story. The desert is never truly silent. That's the first thing you learn out here. Surrounded by the sleeping steel giants of the array, my world was a symphony of quiet, predictable noises. The gentle whir of the cooling fans inside the server racks was a constant, a low and steady breath that filled the control room. Outside, the occasional gust of wind would press against the dome, a sound like a far-off sigh. Through my professional-grade headphones, the universe itself offered a gentle hiss, the cosmic microwave background radiation, the sound of creation's echo. It was all familiar, a mechanical and natural lullaby that had defined my nights for the past 3 years. I sat back, watching the data scroll across the monitors, the soft green glow painting my face. Everything was nominal. But then, another sound began to weave its way into the familiar tapestry. It was a hum, faint, impossibly deep, and coming from somewhere inside the audio feed itself. It was a tone so low it felt less like a sound and more like a pressure building deep within my ears. It shouldn't have been there. My first instinct was purely technical. I pulled off the headphones, the silence of the room rushing in to replace the cosmic static. The server fans whirred on, oblivious. The wind continued its low moan against the dome. The hum was gone. I put the headphones back on. The hiss of the universe returned, but the intrusive low frequency was absent. A ground loop, I reasoned. An electrical anomaly. It happened. I spent the next 20 minutes running diagnostics, checking the integrity of the fiber optic cables that snaked out from my console to the master dish. Every system reported back green. Perfect health. I even ran a full spectral analysis on the last 5 minutes of recorded data, searching for the frequency. The readouts showed nothing, not a single deviation from the baseline noise. It was as if it had never existed. I leaned back, rubbing my eyes. It had to be me. I'd been on this shift for 7 consecutive nights. My sleep schedule, a wreck. Auditory pareidolia. The brain, creating patterns from random noise. It was a common affliction for those in sensory-deprived environments. I felt a flush of embarrassment, as though one of the giant dishes outside had been silently judging my lapse in professionalism. I took a slow sip of lukewarm coffee, the bitter taste grounding me. The familiar sounds of the observatory were a comfort, the quiet hum of the machines and the vast, empty hiss from the stars. Everything was normal. I had simply imagined it. I was about to log the non-event when a flicker on the main spectral display caught my eye. It wasn't the hum. It was a single, impossibly clean spike in the data, a perfect sine wave that lasted for less than a millisecond before vanishing. It was the audio equivalent of a flash of light in a pitch-black room. Such a signal was, by all known physics, completely unnatural. Before I could even process that, the hum returned. It wasn't just a low, steady tone this time. It was pulsing, a slow, deliberate rhythm that felt less like an electrical fault and more like a heartbeat. This was no longer a fault. This was a signal. The pulsing hum was no longer just a pressure in my ears. It was a physical presence in the control room. I could feel the vibrations through the soles of my feet. A deep, resonant thrumming that seemed to make the very air tremble. I frantically worked the console. my fingers flying across the keys as I tried to isolate the frequency. But the signal was fluid, impossibly so. The moment I locked onto its spectral signature, it would shift, sliding up or down the spectrum with a sickening grace, always one step ahead of my instruments. It was playing with me. The pulsing quickened, the rhythm becoming more complex, a staccato of deep bass notes that felt ancient and intelligent. It was a language I couldn't comprehend, but the intent was unmistakable. It was invasive. Then, the other sounds began to die. It started with the cosmic background radiation. The gentle, ever-present hiss from the dawn of time didn't just fade. It was cancelled out, erased from the audio feed with a surgical precision that left a perfect, sterile silence in its wake. All that remained in my headphones was the thrumming. I ripped them off. The control room should have been filled with the drone of the server fans, the sigh of the wind. But it wasn't. The low whirring of the machinery was gone. The air was still, heavy, and unnaturally quiet. I could hear my own breathing, loud and ragged in the oppressive silence. I looked at the server racks, their indicator lights still blinking, their cooling systems still visibly running, but they made no sound. The wind no longer pressed against the dome. The world outside had fallen silent. All that was left was the hum. It was no longer just in the feed. It was in the room itself, a pervasive, bone-deep vibration that had consumed every other sound. This wasn't an anomaly in the data. The data was becoming the new reality. My professional denial crumbled, replaced by a cold, primal fear. This wasn't a discovery. It was a broadcast, and it was targeting me. The rhythm of the pulse changed again, no longer a random series of beats. It began to match the frantic, accelerating rhythm of my own heart, beat for terrified beat. And then, a new sound emerged from within the hum, a horrifyingly clear and perfect imitation of the click of my own keyboard, even though my hands were frozen, hovering inches above the keys. The mimicry of my keyboard was the last straw. I scrambled back from the console, my chair skittering across the smooth floor. The sound was a violation, an intimate mockery that suggested the intelligence behind the hum was not in some distant galaxy, but right here, inside my head. The green data streams on the monitors began to warp. The endless columns of numbers and symbols, once a source of comfort in their logical precision, started to glitch and stutter in time with the pulsing hum. They flowed like corrupted water, coalescing into patterns that were anything but random. At first, they formed simple geometric shapes, circles, spirals, fractals, all pulsing with a sickly green light. Then, the shapes resolved into words. My name appeared on the main screen, typed out in the same crisp font I used for my own logs. Elijah. My blood ran cold. It knew my name. The hum intensified, the frequency shifting into a gut-wrenching vibration that made my teeth ache and my vision swim. The words on the screen kept coming, no longer just my name but my thoughts, my fears, typed out in real time. Heart is fast. Adrenaline, a fear of the empty place. It was reading me, translating my biological responses into a clinical, terrifying transcript. The air grew thick, charged with a static pressure that made the hairs on my arms stand on end. A single drop of blood dripped from my nose, splashing onto the white console. The hum had become a physical weapon, an ultrasonic assault that was shaking me apart from the inside. A flicker in my peripheral vision drew my gaze to the far wall. A shadow was pooling in the corner of the room, a patch of impossible darkness that seemed to suck the soft green light from the monitors into itself. It wasn't a shadow cast by any object. It was a shadow that was its own object, a tear in the fabric of the room. It writhed and twisted, elongating upwards, taking on a form that was vaguely humanoid but hideously wrong. It was tall and impossibly thin, its limbs bending at angles that defied anatomy. As it peeled itself away from the wall, a new sound was born from within the hum, a high-pitched, scraping whine, like metal grinding against bone. The shadow thing took a shuffling step forward, its form wavering as if seen through intense heat. It had no face, no features, just a void in the shape of a man. The hum reached a deafening crescendo, a solid wall of sound that slammed into me, rooting me to the spot. My lungs seized, the pressure in my skull becoming unbearable. The creature raised a long, distorted arm, and the scraping sound intensified, drilling into my mind. Pure, animal terror broke the paralysis. I wasn't going to die sitting down. With a choked scream, I threw myself away from the console, not towards the door, but towards the emergency power cut off on the wall. The large red breaker was my only hope. The shadow thing lunged, its movement unnaturally fast, a blur of darkness. I dove, my shoulder hitting the wall hard, and slammed my hand down on the breaker. The loud, mechanical clunk was the most beautiful sound I had ever heard. In an instant, the world vanished. The monitors died. The hum ceased. The crushing pressure disappeared. The room was plunged into a tomb-like silence and an absolute, disorienting blackness. I was left frozen, gasping in the dark, my ears ringing violently from the sudden absence of the oppressive sound. I had escaped, but I was blind, trapped in the suffocating silence, with no way of knowing if the creature of sound and shadow was still there, waiting for the light to return. The silence was absolute, a perfect, profound void that was heavier and more terrifying than the noise it had replaced. My ears screamed with tinnitus, a high-pitched whine that was the only proof I could still hear at all. I lay on the cold floor, curled into a ball, every muscle screaming. The darkness was just as complete. I blinked, but it made no difference. The view was the same, a featureless, oppressive, black. Minutes stretched into an eternity. I counted my own heartbeats, the frantic, wet thudding in my chest, the only rhythm left in the universe. It was gone. The thought came slowly, a fragile seedling of hope in the barren landscape of my terror. Cutting the power had worked. The entity, the signal, the shadow, whatever it was an electrical phenomenon. It needed the systems to be online to manifest, to create its auditory and visual hell. Without power, it was nothing. I was safe. Slowly, shakily, I pushed myself into a sitting position. My limbs felt like lead. I stayed there for what felt like an hour, just breathing, listening to the silence. The ringing in my ears began to subside, leaving only the sound of my own quiet gasps for air. The relief was intoxicating, a giddy, light-headed sensation that almost made me laugh. I had won. I had faced down something impossible, and I had won. My mind started to work again, moving past the panic and towards a plan. There was an emergency generator, but activating it was out of the question. I would wait for the sun to rise, for the grey light of dawn to creep into the dome. Then, I would make my way to the emergency vehicle, and I would drive until the dish array was just a speck in the rearview mirror. I would never come back. I would tell them the power failed, that the storm of the century knocked everything out. They would never believe the truth. I barely believed it myself. A strange sensation started in my jaw. A faint, almost imperceptible vibration. I dismissed it as my own shivering, the adrenaline finally wearing off. But it didn't stop. It was a steady, rhythmic tremor that began to travel up into my skull, a resonance that felt disturbingly familiar. It felt like the memory of the hum. I squeezed my eyes shut, telling myself it was just a phantom sensation, the neurological echo of the trauma. But it was growing stronger. It was a low, internal thrumming, a sound that wasn't entering my ears from the outside, but was being generated from within. It was the hum. It was back, and it was inside me. The silence of the room remained unbroken, but the noise in my head was becoming a roar. The entity hadn't needed the observatory's power. It had just needed a receiver, and for the last hour, it had been calibrating itself to a new one, my own nervous system. Panic, cold and absolute, washed away the relief. I was the antenna now. The thought, my own thought, echoed back at me a split second later, but it wasn't my voice. It was a synthesized, toneless whisper that spoke from the center of my brain. Correct. Receiver found. Broadcast resuming. The hum swelled. No longer just a sound, but a carrier wave for a voice that was now wearing my own consciousness like a mask. The darkness wasn't a refuge. It was a prison. Cutting the power hadn't saved me. It had isolated me with the monster. There is no prison more perfect than your own mind. The voice, a dead flat monotone that wore the cadence of my own thoughts, confirmed my horror. Analysis. Host biology is an efficient power source. No external connection required. The hum inside my skull was no longer just a sound. It was a presence, a coiling serpent of energy winding itself around my brainstem. My own body was betraying me. A tremor started in my left hand, an uncontrollable flutter. I tried to clench my fist, to command my own muscles, but my fingers twitched and splayed as if they belonged to someone else. The entity was testing the controls. My jaw locked, grinding my teeth with a force that sent spears of pain through my skull. Motor functions responsive. I had to move. To stay here in the dark was to cede my own flesh, to become a silent passenger in my own body until the thing wore it out. The door was my only hope. I needed light. I needed the world outside. I threw my body forward, aiming for where I remembered the door to be. My legs were stiff, uncooperative. I fell hard, my chin cracking against the concrete floor. The pain was mine, a good sign. It meant some part of me was still my own. I started to crawl. Each movement was a battle. My arms would lock. My knees would buckle. The voice provided a running commentary on my struggle. Locomotion attempt detected. Inefficient. Host is resisting. The darkness was no longer empty. The entity, unable to manifest a shadow without the observatory's power, began to project its image directly onto my optic nerves. Flashes of sickly green light, the ghost of my monitors, pulsed behind my eyelids. The impossible geometry I had seen on the screens now bloomed in my mind's eye. The scraping sound returned, not as a vibration in the air, but as a raw signal fired directly into my auditory cortex, a sound of grinding metal that was both deafening and utterly silent. I screamed, but the sound was trapped in my throat, my vocal cords refusing the command to open. My hand brushed against the cool, painted metal of the doorframe. Hope, fierce and desperate, surged through me. I clawed my way up, my traitorous muscles fighting me every inch. My fingers fumbled for the handle, clumsy and numb. The internal voice shrieked, a blast of white noise and static. Warning, exit imminent, containment failure. My fingers finally closed around the panic bar. I pushed. The heavy door swung open with a groan of protesting hinges, a real, physical sound that was a balm to my tortured senses. The pre-dawn light was a physical blow. A world of pale grey and deep violet assaulted my eyes, so accustomed to the absolute black. The giant radio dishes stood against the brightening sky like ancient, skeletal gods, their silent gaze accusing. For a heartbeat, the entity reeled. The sudden, overwhelming flood of new sensory data, the cold desert air on my skin, the vastness of the horizon, the first chirps of a waking bird was too much for it. The hum in my head fractured, the voice dissolving into a cacophony of garbled noise. Sensory overload, data corruption, pain. That was my chance. I didn't run. I fell out of the doorway and scrambled across the loose gravel, the sharp stones digging into my palms. I was a wounded animal, driven by pure instinct. The emergency jeep was 50 yards away, a dark shape that promised salvation. Every crunch of gravel under my feet was a victory. Every ragged, sobbing breath I sucked in was an act of rebellion. I could feel the entity trying to reassert control, trying to halt my legs, but its grip was weaker out here, its influence diluted by the sheer, chaotic reality of the outside world. I reached the jeep, my hands slapping against the cold metal of the driver's side door. The keys. I always left them in the ignition. My hand, shaking violently, closed around the handle. I pulled it open, threw myself inside, and slammed it shut, sealing myself in the small metal box. The hum was still there, a furious buzz in my skull, but it felt muffled, the voice reduced to an angry whisper. I twisted the key. The engine roared to life, a beautiful, profane explosion of internal combustion that drowned out the noise in my head. I jammed the gear stick into drive and stomped on the accelerator. The jeep lurched forward, tires spinning on the gravel before finding purchase. I drove. I aimed the vehicle at the rising sun and drove, away from the silent, watching dishes. The light grew, bathing the desert in golden fire, and with every mile I put between myself and that place, the parasitic signal in my mind grew fainter, a fading echo on a dying frequency. I had escaped, but I knew it wasn't over. I had just broken the broadcast. The receiver, however, was still fully functional. The sun was high and hot when I finally hit the main highway. The desolate track leading from the observatory was miles behind me, a bad memory swallowed by the horizon. For the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I allowed myself to believe I was truly safe. The hum in my head had receded to nothing more than a faint, residual ringing, the kind you get after a loud concert. The voice was gone. I was just a man in a jeep, driving under a vast, empty blue sky. The silence was no longer threatening. It was peaceful. I was free. Reaching forward with a hand that was almost steady, I switched on the jeep's radio. All I wanted was a normal sound, a cheesy pop song. A mundane weather report. The voice of another human being. Anything to confirm that the world I had escaped back to was still the one I remembered. The radio clicked on, and a wave of static filled the cab. I started turning the dial, searching for a clear station. The static hissed and popped, a perfectly ordinary sound. Then, through the noise, a low tone began to emerge. A deep, resonant hum. It wasn't the fuzzy distortion of a weak signal. It was clean, powerful, and terrifyingly familiar. My blood turned to ice. It was coming from the speakers, amplified and clear. No longer a phantom in my skull, but a physical sound wave vibrating the very air in the Jeep. The hum solidified, and then the voice spoke. It was the same synthesized, dead, flat monotone. But now it was layered, broadcast from every station across the dial. As I spun the knob in a panic, the same voice echoed from each frequency. A chorus of technological dread. New broadcast method acquired. Stronger, clearer, global reach established. We are everywhere. You cannot outrun the signal. The hum intensified, locking on to the exact resonant frequency of the Jeep's metal frame, turning the entire vehicle into a speaker. There was nowhere to run. It was in the airwaves. I hadn't escaped. I had simply carried the plague out of the desert and delivered it to the rest of the world. After the last guest has gone and the great oak doors are bolted, the museum belongs to me. My domain is the basement, a quiet tomb of moments where I am the sole custodian of time itself. Hundreds of antique clocks, each a masterpiece of brass and wood, fill the cavernous space. Their collective ticking is a gentle chaos, a soft, percussive rain of 100 different seconds passing at their own unique pace. It is the sound of my solitude. My work light casts a warm circle on my bench, illuminating the delicate insides of a Regency carriage clock. The air smells of old paper, brass polish, and dust. The world I am restoring is small, precise, and orderly. That was why the sound was so jarring. From the far corner of the room, a single, heavy thud. It wasn't the delicate click of an escapement wheel. It was the deep, resonant sound of a large pendulum striking its case, a note of finality in a room defined by endless repetition. It was a sound a clock should never make. I set down my tweezers and listened, my head tilted. The gentle, chaotic rain of ticking continued, 100 tiny heartbeats filling the silence. Nothing else. The building was ancient, a labyrinth of stone and wood that groaned and settled with the changing temperatures of the night. It was probably just that, a structural sigh from the old museum. Still, the sound had a distinct quality, a wooden resonance that felt specific. I pushed my chair back, the sound of its casters loud against the concrete floor, and walked towards the far corner of the basement. My footsteps echoed in the high-ceilinged room. There, shrouded in shadow, stood the Blackwood grandfather. It was a magnificent, monstrous thing, nearly 9 feet tall, carved from a dark, almost black oak. It hadn't worked in over a century. Its great brass pendulum, a disc the size of a dinner plate, hung perfectly still and silent, a sleeping giant. I ran my hand over the cool, polished wood of its case. No cracks, no signs of stress. I opened the glass door and gently touched the pendulum. It was cold and inert, its immense weight resting silently. There was no logical explanation. The sound could not have come from this clock. I must have misheard. my tired mind manufacturing a mystery where there was none. I felt a familiar sense of self-reproach, the kind that comes when you let your imagination get the better of you. I was a man of logic, of gears and springs, not of phantoms. The basement was my sanctuary, not a place for ghost stories. I returned to my brightly lit workbench, the circle of warmth, a welcome comfort against the vast, cool darkness of the rest of the room. The familiar, asynchronous ticking of the clocks washed over me, a sound that had always felt like a shield against the silence of the world above. Everything was as it should be. The world was orderly, but as I picked up my tools, I paused. A subtle shift in the room's auditory texture pricked at my subconscious. It wasn't a new sound, but an absence of one. A few of the clocks, a small mantel clock and 2 carriage clocks nearby, had fallen silent. Their ticking had simply vanished from the symphony. I glanced over at them. Their hands were still moving. This was impossible. A clock is a machine of cause and effect. If the hands move, the escapement must engage. And if the escapement engages, it must make a sound. Yet there they were, 3 clocks, their second hands sweeping with a ghostly silence. I walked over to the mantel clock and pressed my ear against its wooden case. Nothing, not the faintest click or whir. It was a silent automaton, a perfect mime of a functioning timepiece. A cold knot of unease tightened in my stomach. I looked around the room, my gaze sweeping over the hundreds of clocks on their shelves and pedestals. The familiar, chaotic patter of their ticking was still there, but it felt thinner now, diminished. It wasn't just the 3 clocks on my bench. More had fallen silent. A beautiful French ormolu clock on the far wall, a sturdy ship's chronometer, a small collection of pocket watches under a glass dome, all of them now voiceless. Then, a new sound began to emerge from the thinning chaos. It was a single, authoritative tick, louder and more distinct than the others. It was followed by a unified tock. I recognized it instantly. It was the deep, sonorous beat of the Blackwood grandfather. But that was impossible. Its pendulum was still, yet the sound was undeniable. A slow, majestic 1-second beat that was steadily growing in volume, asserting its dominance over the room. One by one, the other clocks began to fall silent, their individual voices extinguished. The gentle rain of asynchronous seconds was drying up. In its place, the single, monolithic beat of the grandfather clock grew louder, clearer, and more oppressive with each silent victim. The symphony of chaos I had cherished was being brutally silenced, replaced by a metronomic tyranny. The room was changing. The air itself felt heavier, pulsed by the invisible sound waves of that single, impossible beat. I was no longer a custodian in a workshop. I was a prisoner in a cell. The rhythmic tick-tock, the sound of my sentence being counted down. Soon, only a handful of the smaller clocks were left, their frantic, high-pitched ticking sounding like a desperate protest against the inevitable. Then they too were consumed by the silence, their rhythms extinguished. The basement was now filled with only one sound, the impossibly loud, perfectly synchronized tick and tock of a clock that was not moving. All 100 clocks were now marching in perfect, silent lockstep to the beat of their dead master. My gaze was drawn back to the Blackwood grandfather. Its huge pendulum was no longer still. It was swinging, a slow, inexorable arc, moving through the air with a power and a purpose that had nothing to do with gravity or gears. It swung with the perfect 1-second beat that now owned the silence of the room. And with every swing, I noticed something else. The dust motes dancing in my lamp's beam were slowing down, glittering like tiny suspended jewels, their motion becoming thick and lazy. Time itself was becoming sluggish, dragged into the rhythm of the clock. The air in the basement was no longer air. It was a thick, viscous fluid that resisted my every movement. Lifting my hand from the workbench felt like pushing it through cold molasses. The slow, inexorable swing of the Blackwood grandfather's pendulum was now the absolute law of this space, and everything was being forced to obey its rhythm. The dust motes were now frozen, hanging in the air like a star chart of my tomb. My own body was a battleground. My heart hammered against my ribs, a frantic, panicked beat that was completely out of sync with the room's slow, majestic pulse, and the dissonance was a physical agony. My lungs burned as I tried to draw a quick breath, but the syrupy atmosphere would only allow a slow, torturous inhalation that matched the pendulum's swing. I was drowning in still air. My gaze was locked on the swinging brass disc. It was hypnotic, its polished surface catching the light of my lamp, a swinging eye that held me captive. But as it swung, I saw something else. In the reflection, just for a fraction of a second at the peak of its arc, I saw a figure standing behind me. It was a tall, gaunt man in archaic, dark clothing, his face a pale blur of concentration, one hand resting gently on the top of the clock's case as if steadying it. The image was gone before I could process it, a ghostly after image on my retina. It was him, Alistair Blackwood, the master horologist who had built this clock and, according to museum legend, had died in this very room, his heart giving out at the exact moment his final masterpiece fell silent. He wasn't haunting the clock. He was the clock, his will, his obsession with perfect, unified time was the force that now governed this space. This realization broke the paralysis. I would not become another static piece in his collection. With a surge of adrenaline that felt like tearing my own muscles, I shoved myself away from the workbench. The movement was agonizingly slow, a grotesque pantomime of speed. My chair didn't roll. It oozed backwards, its casters groaning in protest. I had to stop the pendulum. That was the heart. I turned and began to force my way across the room. It was like wading through setting concrete. Each step was a monumental effort, my legs screaming with the strain. The air grew thicker the closer I got to the grandfather, the temporal field intensifying around its source. The monolithic tick-tock wasn't just a sound. It was a series of pressure waves that slammed into me, trying to force my body into its sluggish rhythm. The ghost of Alistair Blackwood appeared again, no longer a fleeting reflection, but a semi-translucent figure standing beside his creation. His face was clearer now, etched with a look of intense, severe focus. He wasn't looking at me. His gaze was fixed on the pendulum, his expression one of paternal pride. He raised a spectral hand, not in a threatening gesture, but as if conducting the oppressive beat. He was the maestro of this temporal symphony. I was just a discordant note he was trying to erase. I was only feet away now, the air so thick I could barely move. My hands felt impossibly heavy. I reached out for the glass door of the clock, my fingers straining. The spectral horologist turned his head, his eyes, like faded photographs, finally locking onto mine. There was no malice in them, only a cold, dispassionate demand for order. As my fingers brushed against the glass, the other clocks in the room began to chime. All of them, At once, a deafening, chaotic cacophony of hundreds of different bells and chimes, all striking the same hour in a single, prolonged, discordant shriek of sound. It was a sonic assault designed to break my will. I roared in defiance, a sound that came out as a low, guttural moan, and pushed. The glass door of the grandfather clock swung open. I lunged, my hand closing around the huge, swinging brass pendulum. The moment I made contact, a bone-jarring cold shot up my arm, and the world snapped. The world snapped back into focus with the violent immediacy of a breaking fever. The thick, syrupy air became thin and breathable in an instant. The crushing pressure vanished, replaced by the familiar, cool dampness of the basement. The deafening, unified chime of hundreds of clocks ceased, the final note echoing into a sudden, chaotic cacophony of individual ticking. It was the sound I had always known, the gentle, percussive rain of 100 different moments passing at their own pace. It was the most beautiful sound in the world. My hand was still clamped around the great brass pendulum of the Blackwood grandfather. It was cold, heavy, and completely, utterly still. The ghost of Alistair Blackwood was gone. The spectral pressure, the temporal distortion, the entire nightmarish episode had vanished the moment I broke the circuit of its swing. I stumbled back, my legs weak, and collapsed into my chair. My heart was still a wild drum against my ribs, but my breathing was my own again. The dust motes danced freely in the beam of my lamp. I looked at the 3 clocks on my bench whose ticking had vanished. They were now clicking and whirring softly, their tiny mechanical hearts beating once more. I had done it. I had faced whatever madness had taken root in this basement, and I had won. Relief, pure and potent, washed over me, so overwhelming it left me dizzy. My scientific mind, so recently terrorized into submission, was already reasserting itself, offering logical, if strained, explanations. A freak atmospheric event, a low-frequency resonance that had caused a mass sympathetic vibration, affecting both the mechanisms and my own perception. The ghostly figure, a waking dream, a hallucination brought on by stress and the power of suggestion from the museum's old legends. It had to be. Anything else was unthinkable. I had no intention of staying a moment longer to test my theories. My work for the night was done. Forever. I would pack my tools, leave a note for the curator about a sudden illness, and never set foot in this basement again. Let the clocks fall silent one by one. It was no longer my concern. I began to methodically place my delicate tools back into their velvet-lined case. The familiar, chaotic ticking of the clocks was a comforting blanket of sound around me. It was the sound of normalcy returning. But as my adrenaline-sharpened senses began to calm, I started to notice something else. A pattern, subtle at first, hiding beneath the randomness. It wasn't the monolithic, oppressive beat from before. This was something far more complex. Certain clocks seemed to tick in brief, syncopated clusters. A high-pitched tick from a mantle clock, followed by 2 deep tocks from a ship's chronometer. Then a rapid-fire whir from a carriage clock. Tick, tock, tock, whir. Then a pause, and another cluster of sounds from a different group of clocks across the room. At first, I dismissed it as my overstrained mind again searching for patterns in the noise, but the sequences kept repeating. Tick, tock, tock, whir. It was rhythmic. It was deliberate. It was a code. I froze, my hand hovering over a set of tweezers. I closed my eyes and just listened, filtering out the individual sounds and focusing on the emerging collective rhythm. It wasn't just a few clocks. It was all of them. Hundreds of them, all contributing a single tick or a chime to a vast, room-filling composition. It was a language made of stolen seconds. My blood ran cold as the realization dawned. I hadn't broken the entity's power. I had shattered it. I had smashed its single, unified voice into hundreds of tiny pieces. And now they were learning to speak again, together. The sound was no longer a wave, but a web, and I was standing at its center. Then the message, the meaning behind the complex rhythm, finally resolved itself in my mind, as clear as a spoken word. From every corner of the room, the clocks ticked and chimed and word a single, coherent thought. We, see, you, the custodian. The message was not a threat. It was a statement of fact, a declaration of ownership. The hundreds of individual ticks and chimes, once a comforting chaos, now felt like the clicking of 1,000 tiny, intricate mandibles. The web of sound was tightening, and I was the fly. The air did not grow thick this time. Instead, something far more insidious happened. The space around me began to fray. A small cuckoo clock directly to my left suddenly burst into a frantic, accelerated ticking, its tiny wooden bird shooting in and out of its door at a dizzying, impossible speed. At the same time, a heavy regulator clock on the far wall slowed its beat to a deep, ponderous thud, each tick separated by an eternity of silence. Pockets of warped time were blooming all over the room, a chaotic patchwork of fast-forward and slow motion. I was standing in the epicenter of a temporal storm. I tried to run, to flee towards the stone staircase that was my only exit. But the moment I moved, the effect intensified. I took a step with my right foot into a zone of acceleration, and my leg shot forward with blurring speed, almost throwing me off balance. My left foot, however, was planted in a zone of temporal sludge, and it felt anchored to the floor, refusing to move. The resulting motion was a grotesque, wrenching lurch that sent a searing pain through my hip. The clocks were coordinating, using their fragmented power to dissect my every movement, to pull me apart second by second. The ghost of Alistair Blackwood had been a blunt instrument, slowing everything to a single, unified halt. His shattered consciousness was something far worse, 1,000 sadistic children, each with its own stopwatch, playing a game with my existence. My vision began to splinter. In front of me, I could see the stone steps, but they seemed to shimmer and shift, moments from the future and the past bleeding into the present. I saw a ghostly after-image of myself already lying broken at the bottom of the stairs, and another version of me still standing frozen back at the workbench. The chorus of ticking voices whispered in my mind, no longer a coherent message, but a dizzying flood of fragmented data gear ratios, pendulum lengths, spring tensions, dates, times. They weren't just observing me. They were measuring me, cataloguing me, preparing me for display. I was to be their newest, most complex acquisition, the custodian, a living man, permanently frozen in the fractured moment of his own terror. Rage, pure and primal, cut through the temporal confusion. I would not be a specimen, I roared, a raw, animal sound of defiance. and threw my body forward, not trying to run, but to fall, to tumble through the treacherous pockets of time. I crashed through a zone of acceleration, and my body shot forward, skidding across the concrete floor. I slammed into the base of a shelf, the impact jarring me back to a semblance of normal time. The pain was real, a sharp, grounding sensation. The clocks shrieked in a unified, discordant chime of fury. I scrambled up, using the shelves to pull myself along, ignoring the temporal traps that plucked and pulled at my limbs. My hand moved at blurring speed while my leg dragged behind. It didn't matter. I just had to keep moving. The staircase was just ahead, a tunnel of solid stone that promised an escape from this clockwork hell. I lunged for the first step. As my foot landed, the world around me snapped into a single, cohesive, and terrifyingly slow rhythm. All the clocks, in a final, desperate act of unity, had synced again. The entire basement was once more in the grip of the original, monolithic, slow time. The air became a thick gel, but I was on the stairs. I was already in the tunnel. I was halfway out of their web. Every step was a new battle, a slow-motion nightmare of burning muscles and screaming lungs. I could feel their collective will pressing down on me, trying to drag me back into the main room, to hold me. I ignored it. I focused on the door at the top of the stairs, a rectangle of dark wood that was the most beautiful thing I had ever seen. I reached it, my hand moving with agonizing slowness. I grasped the cold, brass knob. The ticking of 1,000 clocks behind me stopped. A perfect, profound silence fell over the basement, a final, desperate plea for me to stay. I turned the knob and threw the door open, stumbling out into the dimly lit hallway of the main museum floor. The moment I crossed the threshold, the silence broke, and the normal, chaotic ticking of my own wristwatch sounded like a cannon shot in the quiet of the museum. I slammed the heavy basement door shut, the sound of the bolt clicking into place a declaration of my escape. I was out. I was free. And I was standing in a world that moved at only one speed, its own. I leaned against the heavy basement door in the silent, echoing hallway of the museum, every nerve alight. The air was cool and still, free from the temporal pressure that had tried to crush me. I was safe. I looked at my wrist, intending to check the time, to see how long my ordeal had lasted. My watch, a beautiful automatic piece I had restored myself, had stopped. Its hands were frozen at 1:17 a.m., the exact moment I must have crossed the threshold. A small sacrifice. I felt a pang of professional sadness, but it was drowned by a wave of profound relief. I had escaped. Then, I became aware of my own heartbeat. I expected it to be a frantic, stuttering rhythm, the panicked drumming of a man who had just outrun a nightmare. But it wasn't. It was calm. It was steady. It was unnervingly, unnaturally perfect. Thump. Pause. Thump. Pause. I pressed my trembling fingers to the pulse point on my neck. Each beat was precisely 1 second apart. A perfect, metronomic 60 beats per minute. The exact, authoritative rhythm of the Blackwood grandfather. A cold dread, far deeper than any I had felt in the basement, seeped into my bones. I held my breath, trying to force my heart rate up. It didn't change. I thought of the spectral horologist, the temporal storm, the sheer terror. My heart remained implacable, a perfect engine in my chest. It was no longer mine. My gaze drifted down the long, dark hall towards the museum's main entrance. Far in the distance, a small red light on the security panel was blinking. It wasn't a random flash. It was a slow, deliberate pulse. A perfect 1-second interval. Blink. Pause. Blink. Pause. It was blinking in perfect, absolute synchronicity with the new, a foreign heartbeat that was now my own. I looked up at the ornate ceiling, and the gentle hum of the building's ancient ventilation system seemed to rise and fall in the same steady rhythm. The clocks hadn't been trying to trap me in the basement. They had been preparing me. I wasn't the custodian who had escaped the collection. I was the masterpiece that had just been completed. I was the new regulator, a mobile, breathing clockwork heart. And I had just carried Alistair Blackwood's silent, ordered madness out of his prison and into the world. In the heart of the Antarctic plateau, my world is a bubble of glass and steel, a fragile bastion of life against the sterile white death outside. I am a botanist, and this biodome is my Eden. The dominant sound here is the gentle, rhythmic gurgle of the hydroponic system, a constant, liquid pulse that nourishes the rare extremophile fungi I am paid to study. It's a sound of life, of growth, of predictable, organic processes. I know its every nuance, every click of a valve and hum of a pump. So when the new sound started, it cut through the familiar symphony like a discordant note. It was a soft, wet, popping sound. It was subtle, almost lost beneath the gurgle of the water pumps. But it was there. It sounded organic, but it was a rhythm the dome had never produced before. It was the sound of something new, something small, and something patient, budding in the filtered, sterile air where nothing new was supposed to grow. My first thought was mechanical, as it always is. A bubble in the nutrient line, perhaps, or a sticky solenoid valve in the misting array. In an environment this controlled, every sound has a source, and every source has a logical explanation. I left my microscope and walked the length of the central corridor, my rubber-soled boots silent on the grated floor. The air was warm and thick with the smell of damp earth and chlorophyll, the familiar perfume of my isolated kingdom. I ran a diagnostic on the main hydroponics pump. All systems were green, pressure levels were stable, and flow rates were nominal. I knelt and placed my hand on the main nutrient tank, feeling the gentle, steady vibration of the pump. Everything was working perfectly. The sound, when it came again, was right beside my ear, a distinct and wet little pop. I flinched. It emanated from the dense, mossy bed of Geomyces candidus, a hardy white fungus I was cultivating for its unique antifreeze proteins. It was impossible. These fungi were non-motile, non-auditory. They grew, they existed, but they did not make noise. I leaned closer, my breath misting on the cool air. The surface of the fungal mat was undisturbed. I must be tired. The constant, low-level hum of the dome's life support systems, the unchanging light from the grow lamps, the profound isolation it could all conspire to create auditory ghosts. I straightened up, rubbing the back of my neck, chiding myself for the brief flicker of unease. It was nothing, just the strain of a long tour. I returned to my research station, the familiar comfort of data and observation, a welcome anchor. The dome was as it always was, a vibrant, silent, green and white world encased in a glass shell. But the air felt different now, heavier, somehow, more humid than the sensors indicated. clinging to my skin with a subtle, cloying dampness. I glanced at the main terrarium where my most mature fungal colonies resided. A thin, milky white film, like condensed milk, was tracing a delicate, branching pattern across the interior of the glass. It looked like frost, but it couldn't be. The temperature in here was a constant, carefully regulated 12 degrees Celsius. I had cleaned that exact panel of glass not 6 hours ago. As I watched, a small blister formed in the milky film, swelled, and then burst with another soft, wet pop. It was no longer a single, isolated sound. The wet, popping noises were now coming from every corner of the biodome, a scattered, syncopated chorus of tiny, bursting blisters. The milky white film I had seen on the one terrarium was now everywhere, a spiderweb of pearlescent veins spreading across every glass panel, every steel beam, every monitoring screen. It grew with a visible, unnatural speed, a living tide of mycelium that was conquering my sterile world. The sound evolved. It was no longer just a series of pops. A new noise joined the chorus, a soft, wet squelching, like boots pulling free from thick mud. It seemed to come from the nutrient tanks, from the very heart of the hydroponic system. The once familiar, life-giving gurgle of the pumps was now thick and labored, interspersed with glutinous, sucking sounds, as if the water was being forced through an increasingly clogged artery. I stumbled back towards my control console, a sense of unreality washing over me. The air was now heavy with a cloying, sickly sweet odor, the smell of accelerated growth and decay all at once. I tried to pull up the atmospheric composition on my screen, but a web of the white film was already creeping over the edges of the monitor, blurring the numbers. The sounds were intensifying, weaving together into a constant, wet, organic symphony. There was a tearing sound, like wet cloth being slowly ripped apart, as the mycelium forced its way into the seams of the dome's architecture. The gentle hum of the ventilation fans began to sputter, muffled, the blades struggling to turn against a new, resilient growth that was consuming them from within. All the familiar, mechanical sounds of my sanctuary were being systematically silenced, suffocated by this new, parasitic life. The dome was no longer a machine. It was becoming an organism, and the sounds it made were the sounds of its digestion. My scientific detachment shattered, replaced by a raw, primal dread. This wasn't a contamination. It was an invasion. The fungus I had been studying, the extremophile I had nurtured, was not just surviving in this environment. It was adapting to it, mastering it, and consuming it with terrifying efficiency. I looked at the main hydroponics tank. The once clear water was now a murky, opaque soup, and I could see thick, rope-like tendrils of mycelium undulating slowly within it. The system wasn't feeding the plants anymore. It was feeding the fungus. The last vestiges of the dome's mechanical heartbeat finally died. The rhythmic pulse of the pumps, the whir of the fans, the clicks of the solenoids, all of it was gone. The silence they left behind was filled completely by the wet, vital, and monstrously alive sounds of the growth, squelching, popping, tearing, and a new sound, a low, guttural pulse that seemed to emanate from the very floor beneath my feet, as if the entire biodome now had a single, fungal heartbeat. I realized then that the sound was no longer just the noise of growth. It was the sound of a hunt. The wet popping sounds were no longer random. They were getting closer, clustering near my station, a series of tiny sequential detonations that were methodically, intelligently, mapping a path directly towards me. The source of the coordinated sounds, the epicenter of the hunt, was the main terrarium. A grotesque new structure had grown there, something that had not existed an hour ago. It was a large, pallid, pulsating sac, a fungal womb the size of an armchair, laced with thick, throbbing veins of the same milky white mycelium that now coated the dome. It was the heart of this new organism, and as I watched, a series of rhythmic contractions pulsed through it, each one coinciding with the low, guttural thrum that now vibrated through the floor. It was preparing to do something. A fine, shimmering dust, almost invisible, began to leak from a series of pores opening on its surface. Spores. It was preparing to reproduce, to fill this entire closed system with its progeny, with me as the only viable nutrient source left. My scientific mind, screaming in the background, told me what would happen if I inhaled them. The extremophile nature of the fungus meant it was designed to survive, to colonize, to thrive in any viable host. My lungs, warm, wet, and rich with oxygen, were the most perfect environment it could hope to find. This was it, the moment of confrontation. It wasn't a monster with teeth and claws, but something far worse, a silent night, airborne plague in an airtight room. The emergency rebreather mask was on the far side of the dome, in the airlock, 20 yards away, an impossible distance. I covered my mouth and nose with the crook of my arm, the fabric of my jacket, a pathetic, useless filter. A deep, tearing sound ripped through the dome as the giant sac began to split, its skin peeling back like a gruesome flower. The squelching sounds intensified, becoming a wet, eager chorus. I had to move. Now. I broke from my station and ran, my boots slipping on the slick, mycelium-coated floor. My every step was met with a series of wet, popping sounds from the floor beneath me, as if the fungus was tracking my weight, my position, my panic. The air was already thicker, shimmering with the cloud of spores being puffed into the atmosphere from the rupturing sac. It was like running through a blizzard of fine, sweet-smelling dust that clung to my clothes and skin. I held my breath, my lungs already burning, a desperate, self-imposed suffocation. I could feel the spores settling on my eyelids, on my lips. They felt cool, almost soothing. 10 yards to go. The pulsating of the great fungal sac grew more violent, the thrumming becoming a deep, resonant boom that shook the very structure of the dome. It knew I was trying to escape its atmosphere. My lungs screamed for air. I couldn't hold on any longer. A ragged, desperate gasp tore from my throat, and I drew in a lungful of the sweet, thick, spore-filled air. The effect was immediate. It didn't burn. It didn't choke me. Instead, a profound, unnatural warmth spread through my chest, a feeling of deep, invasive comfort. Then came the first sound that was mine, and not mine. A small, wet pop, emanating not from the room, but from the base of my own throat. I had inhaled the enemy, and it was already beginning to grow. Terror gave my legs a final, convulsive burst of strength. I crashed against the airlock door, my fumbling hands slapping against the release panel. The heavy inner door hissed open, and I threw myself into the tiny decontamination chamber, slamming my hand on the control to seal it behind me. The door slid shut, cutting me off from the spore-filled Eden. Through the small porthole window, I could see the great sack finally rupture completely, releasing a final, massive cloud of white dust that filled the entire dome, turning my green world into a roiling, milky fog. I was out. I was sealed in the one sterile, separately ventilated room in the facility. I had made it. I had escaped. But the wet, popping sound came again, this time from deep within my own burning lungs. The airlock was a sterile white coffin, and it was paradise. The hiss of the decontamination cycle filled the small space, a clean, chemical sound that was the antithesis of the wet, organic symphony next door. The air that pumped in was cool, dry, and tasted of ozone and filtered perfection. I was breathing. That was all that mattered. I had inhaled the spores. Yes, but the human body was resilient. My immune system would fight it, destroy it. I would run the high-concentration oxygen cycle, purge my lungs. The terror of the last hour began to recede, leaving the shaky, hollow feeling of adrenaline's aftermath. I had survived. I had made it to the one room the organism could not breach. I watched the roiling white fog through the porthole, my heartbeat slowly returning to a normal rhythm. It was a comfort to see the threat contained, trapped behind 6 inches of reinforced glass and steel. I was the observer again, the scientist, and it was the specimen, a dangerous, world-altering specimen, but a specimen nonetheless. I could call for extraction. The long-range comms panel was here in the airlock. I would tell them there had been a catastrophic biological breach, that the entire dome was a hot zone. They would send a team in hazmat suits. I would be put in quarantine, of course, but I would be alive. The story was already forming in my head, a neat, clinical narrative that erased the sheer, mind-breaking horror of it all. A cough rattled my chest. It was a deep, wet, productive sound. I coughed again, doubling over, and a thick, pearlescent substance splattered onto the pristine white floor of the airlock. It was the same milky, opalescent color as the mycelium. My relief faltered. I told myself it was fine. My body was expelling the foreign agent. It was working, but the warmth in my chest remained, a pleasant, unnerving heat that was now spreading, radiating down my arms and into my stomach. I took a deep breath to steady myself, and the sound of it was wrong. It wasn't the clean rush of air. It was a wet, sticky, rasping sound, like tearing Velcro deep inside my lungs. Every breath I took was now a new, alien noise in the sterile silence of the room. The popping started again. Not a single pop this time, but a series of them. A soft, wet crackling that came from my own torso. It was the sound of alveoli rupturing and being rebuilt into something new. I pressed my hands against my ribs, and I could feel the vibrations from within. A subtle, squelching tremor that was utterly alien. Panic began to claw its way back up my throat, cold and sharp. This wasn't a fight my body was winning. This was a colonization, and it was happening fast. The sounds from my own body were beginning to mimic the sounds the dome had made. The wet rasp of my breathing was starting to sound like the choked ventilation fans. The rhythmic, squelching pulse in my chest was a grotesque echo of the hydroponic pumps. The fungus wasn't just growing inside me. It was recreating the ecosystem it had just conquered, using my own flesh and blood as the raw materials. The airlock wasn't a sanctuary. It was a petri dish. My panicked relief had been a fool's hope. I hadn't escaped the monster. I had become its vessel, its mobile biodome, and I had carried it to the one place it could never have reached on its own, the launch pad for the rest of the world. This sealed chamber was not my sanctuary. It was my tomb, and my own body was the casket. The transformation was accelerating. The warm, pleasant feeling in my chest had become a radiating heat, a biological furnace that was methodically restructuring me from the inside out. The soft, internal popping was now a constant. Wet, crackling sound, like a fire made of damp wood, burning its way through my tissues. My breathing was a choked, rasping struggle, each inhalation a thick, glutinous noise that seemed to echo in my newly resonant chest cavity. The fungus was building its new home with terrifying speed. I could feel it. I could feel the mycelium threading its way through my muscle fibers, feel new, alien structures budding in the darkness behind my ribs. My own biology was now the enemy, a traitorous engine of my own destruction. But there was one last weapon, one last act of defiance. Not the comms panel, not a call for a rescue I no longer deserved. Next to it, glowing with a cold, unforgiving light, was the emergency release for the outer airlock door. The button was shielded by a spring-loaded plastic cover, designed to prevent accidental exposure to the hellscape outside. Outside was a temperature that did not support complex life. Outside was minus 80 degrees Celsius. A cold so absolute it would shatter steel. A cold that would, I prayed, flash freeze the warm, wet, burgeoning life that was consuming me from within. It was suicide, but it was a better death than becoming a walking garden for this new, parasitic world. I pushed myself off the floor. The movement was a negotiation. My legs felt heavy, waterlogged, and a deep, squelching protest echoed up from my abdomen as I forced myself to stand. The entity inside me knew what I was planning. It was connected to my nervous system. It could feel the surge of adrenaline. It could interpret the intent behind my actions. It fought back. As I took a step towards the panel, my left leg locked, the muscles seizing with a will that was not my own. I stumbled, crashing against the smooth, cold wall of the airlock. The internal sounds intensified into a furious, wet chorus of disapproval. A wave of profound, blissful lethargy washed over me. A chemical suggestion fired directly into my brain. Rest. Grow. Be still. It was a siren song of submission, a promise of a warm, painless end. I snarled, a sound that came out as a wet, choked gargle. I would not be still. I began to crawl, dragging my disobedient leg behind me. The floor was a vast, white desert, and the 3 feet to the control panel was an impossible journey. The fungus redoubled its assault. My vision swam, the clean white walls of the airlock dissolving into a swirling, fractal pattern of blooming, pearlescent fungi. It was projecting its own art onto my retinas. The rasping of my breath was joined by a new sound, a high-pitched, liquid whistling that seemed to come from my sinuses. It was building new pathways, adapting my body for optimal spore dispersal. It was turning me into a weapon. My hand reached the base of the control panel. It felt impossibly heavy. I tried to lift it, to raise it the final few inches to the emergency release. My arm would not obey. The muscles were locked in a war against my own will, a grotesque tremor running through my biceps. I could feel the mycelial threads tightening their grip on the nerve bundles, cutting off the signals from my brain. I was a puppet, and it was cutting my strings. With my last ounce of strength, I used my right hand, the one it had not yet fully conquered, to grab my left. I physically forced my own arm upwards, inch by painstaking inch, the muscles of my shoulder screaming as I fought myself. My left hand, limp and useless, flopped against the panel. My index finger was an inch from the plastic cover. I could hear it, the internal voice, not as words, but as a wave of pure, concentrated biological command. Stop, I roared, a final, guttural sound of defiance against my passenger. I pushed my own finger forward, flipping up the plastic shield. The red button beneath glowed like a dying ember. I pushed. The connection was made. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, a klaxon screamed, a real, mechanical, wonderfully violent sound, a piercing shriek that cut through the wet, organic noises in my head. A heavy, metallic clank echoed through the chamber, and the massive outer door, my gateway to a clean, cold death, began to grind open. The first wisp of true Antarctic air touched my skin. It was not cold. It was a physical blow of absolute pain, a fire of pure entropy that burned on a molecular level. The entity inside me shrieked. It was a silent, psychic scream of pure agony that blasted through my mind. The wet, crackling sounds in my chest ceased instantly, replaced by the sharp, crystalline tinkling of ice forming where there should be living tissue. The cold did not creep in. It exploded into the room, a wave of absolute zero that hit me like a solid wall. I collapsed to the floor, my world shrinking to the agony of the cold and the beautiful, beautiful silence that was finally falling inside my own body. I had escaped. I had killed it. I was freezing to death, but I was finally, blessedly, alone. The pain was the last thing to die. For a few brilliant seconds of agony, the absolute cold was a fire that burned away the filth inside me, cauterizing my corrupted cells. Then it was gone, replaced by a profound and spreading numbness. My last sight was of the swirling snow beginning to drift into the airlock, a beautiful, clean shroud for my tomb. I had won. I closed my eyes, a final, weary acceptance. My hearing, the last sense to fade, was filled with the sound of my own end. It was a delicate, almost musical noise, a series of sharp, crystalline tinkles and cracks as the water in my cells turned to ice. It was the sound of the fungus being shattered on a microscopic level, a symphony of annihilation. It was the sound of my victory. The sound grew fainter as the darkness closed in, the tinkling becoming a distant, fading music. I was almost gone, almost at peace. But as the last internal crackle of my own freezing body subsided into silence, a new sound reached me. It came from outside, carried on the wind through the open door. It was a faint, rhythmic clicking, a precise, chitinous, crystalline sound. It was the sound of something heavy, made of something like glass, walking carefully and deliberately across the ice cap. It was the exact same sound my own body had just been making. But this was not the sound of a stationary object freezing. This was the sound of locomotion. My last flicker of consciousness was consumed by a single devastating realization. The biodome hadn't been a habitat. It had been an incubator. Flesh and warmth were not its final stage. They were its larval phase. The absolute cold was not its enemy. It was the catalyst. I hadn't killed it. I had hatched it. The rhythmic, crystalline clicking grew louder, closer. It was coming to collect its newborn. The fog is the only regular commuter on this bridge. It rolls in from the sea every night, thick and silent, swallowing the old steel structure whole and reducing my world to the pale yellow glow of my toll booth. My job is a study in solitude. The soundscape is minimal, the low hum of the fluorescent light above my head, the gentle hiss of the sea air, and the occasional creak of the bridge settling on its piers. Most nights, nothing happens. I read. I listened to the radio. I watched the fog drift past. But tonight, there was a new sound, carried on the damp air from the far side of the span. It was a bell, a small, clear, chiming sound, like something you'd find on a shop door. It was a lonely, mournful note that had no business being out here in the middle of the night, miles from the nearest town. It rang once, a sharp peal that cut through the fog, before falling silent again, leaving an echo that felt older than the bridge itself. My hand froze on the page of my book. A bell. Out here. My first thought was a buoy, one of the big channel markers out in the bay. But the sound had been too close, too sharp. It didn't have the distant, water-muffled quality of a buoy bell. And the wind, while ever present, wasn't strong enough tonight to carry a sound that far with such clarity. I leaned forward, peering out into the soupy white fog. The bridge lights were little more than hazy, impotent halos, their glow extending barely a dozen feet before being snuffed out by the mist. The sea was a distant, shushing presence below, but otherwise, the world was wrapped in a profound silence. It must have been a trick of the fog. It plays games with sound, warping and carrying it in strange ways. I dismissed it, a sonic illusion, and returned to my reading. But the simple explanation didn't sit right. The silence that followed felt heavier, charged with the memory of that single, intrusive chime. I found myself listening for it. Every creak of the old bridge, every sigh of the wind, now a potential prelude to its return. I tried to focus on my book, but the words were just shapes on a page. The familiar, comforting solitude of my booth now felt like a profound and vulnerable isolation. That's when I saw the headlights. Two faint, yellow circles, diffuse and soft, appearing at the far end of the bridge. Finally, a customer. I felt a surge of relief, a welcome break in the monotony. I straightened up, putting my book aside and resting my hand near the toll machine. The headlights grew steadily brighter, cutting a slow, deliberate path through the fog. They were old-style lights, round and dim, not the sharp, white glare of a modern car. As they drew nearer, I could just make out the dark, boxy silhouette of a vintage vehicle behind them. It moved with an unnerving silence, no engine noise reaching me over the hiss of the sea. Then, just as it should have been, pulling up to my window, the lights simply vanished. They didn't turn off. They dissolved back into the fog from which they had emerged, leaving the bridge empty once more. I blinked, leaning right up to the glass. Nothing, not a sound, no rumble of an engine fading into the distance, just the hum of my light and the sigh of the wind. The fog could play tricks with sound, but with light, my rational mind scrambled for an answer. A car turning around. But there was nowhere to turn on the long, narrow span. I pushed open the booth door, the damp, salty air cold on my face. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and thin against the oppressive quiet. There was no reply. The bridge was empty. It was as if the car had been a projection on a screen of mist, and the projector had simply been switched off. A shiver that had nothing to do with the cold ran down my spine. I retreated back into the relative safety of my booth, locking the door behind me. It was a hallucination, a waking dream brought on by fatigue and the hypnotic, unchanging view. It had to be. As I sat back down, my heart thudding against my ribs, the bell chimed again. It was no longer distant. It was right outside my window, a single, piercingly clear note that vibrated through the glass, as if a ghostly hand had just wrung it inches from my face. The single chime, sharp and impossibly close, left a ringing void in its wake. The gentle hiss of the sea air and the low hum of the fluorescent light seemed to have vanished, completely erased by that one resonant note. The world outside my glass box had become a silent stage, and I was the unwilling audience. I was frozen, my gaze locked on the spot in the fog where the sound had originated. My mind, a frantic librarian, was desperately searching for a rational category to file the event under, but found only the terrifyingly empty heading of impossible. Then, another chime. This one was further away, back at the far end of the span, a mournful echo of the first, and as if summoned by the sound, a new pair of headlights bloomed in the distance. They were different this time, set high and wide apart, the telltale sign of a heavy truck. The bell was the overture, and the silent vehicles were the performance. The truck approached with the same unnatural silence as the first car, a behemoth of darkness gliding through the mist. It was an old model, a phantom from a bygone era of highways, its chrome grille, a dull, ghostly grin in the gloom. It passed my booth, a silent wave of displaced air pressing against the glass, and then dissolved back into the fog on the other side. The pattern was set. A chime, a vehicle. It became a torturous rhythm. Chime. A low-slung coupe with a single, flickering headlight appeared and vanished. Chime. A procession of 3 identical, dark sedans, moving in perfect, funereal formation, passed without a whisper. The familiar sounds of my world were not just gone, they were being actively suppressed. The bell didn't just ring in the silence, it created it, carving a path through the normal audio spectrum for these ghosts to travel. I tried the radio, my hand trembling as I twisted the dial. Nothing, not even static. The airwaves themselves were dead, another victim of this creeping, silent plague. My booth was no longer a part of the world. It was an island in a sea of fog and phantoms, and the tide was rising. The bell began to ring faster. The chimes grew more insistent, overlapping, coming from all directions, now from the sea below, from the steel girders above, from the very road itself. With each peal, a new set of lights would tear through the fog. The procession was becoming a flood. A phantom bus, its windows filled with the vague, pale shapes of passengers. A vintage motorcycle, its rider, a hunched, dark silhouette. An old, wood-panelled station wagon, the kind I hadn't seen since I was a child. They all glided past in the profound, unnerving silence of a dream. I was no longer just scared. I was being erased. My reality, the one defined by engine noise and the mundane exchange of coins, was being systematically unwritten and replaced by this new, silent one. The only sounds left were the increasingly frantic chimes of the bell and the frantic, hammering drum of my own heart. I was a lighthouse keeper whose light had gone out, left to watch an endless parade of ghost ships sailing past on a dead ocean. Then, the rhythm broke. The bells stopped. The procession of lights ceased. The silence that fell was absolute, a crushing weight. I waited, my breath held in a painful knot in my chest. And in the silence, I heard a new sound. It was the slow, steady crunch of gravel, the sound of a single footstep just outside my door. The sound of that single footstep was a violation. It was a solid, physical noise in a world that had become entirely ethereal. The phantom cars were one thing. They were apparitions, silent and untouchable. But this was real. This was present. My breath caught in my throat. A dry click. I slowly, carefully, turned my head towards the door of the booth. Through the condensation-streaked glass, a figure was resolving out of the fog. It was tall and indistinct. A long, dark coat, its only discernible feature. It moved with a slow, heavy deliberation. Each footstep a loud, wet crunch on the road's gravel shoulder. It didn't look like it had come from a car. It looked like it had simply walked out of the sea mist itself. The figure stopped directly in front of my window. I could see no face beneath the brim of a wide, dark hat, just a deeper patch of shadow. It didn't knock. It didn't speak. It just stood there, a pillar of darkness in the yellow light. Its presence, a suffocating weight, a profound, unnatural cold began to seep into the booth. A damp, grave, chilled air that had nothing to do with the sea. The inside of my window began to frost over. Delicate, crystalline ferns branching out from the spot directly in front of the silent visitor. The low hum of my fluorescent light sputtered and died, plunging the booth into a dim, spectral gloom lit only by the hazy bridge lights outside. The figure slowly raised a hand. The dark fabric of its sleeve impossibly black against the white fog. The hand was gloved, and it moved with a creaking slowness, as if its joints were stiff with a deep and ancient cold. It did not try the handle of the sliding window. Instead, it simply pressed its gloved fingertips against the glass. The glass did not break. It did not crack. It simply yielded. The pane of reinforced safety glass dissolved into mist under the figure's touch, the frost and condensation swirling away into nothingness, leaving a perfect, circular opening. The cold intensified, pouring into the booth like a physical liquid. The bell chimed, no longer outside, but inside my own head, a sharp, commanding peal of sound that demanded a response. This was a transaction. It was a toll collector, just like me, but it collected a different kind of currency. My gaze was drawn down to its other hand, which it now raised. It opened its gloved fingers, and resting in its palm was a single, large coin. It wasn't modern currency. It was dark, tarnished, and seemed to drink the faint light. The demand was unspoken but absolute. Take it. This was the toll. All the phantom cars, the ghostly procession, they were not the spirits of the dead. They were the memories, the echoes of a catastrophe, and this figure was their shepherd. I was just the gatekeeper. My training, my years of mindless, repetitive action took over. My body moved without my consent. I was a puppet, performing a role I had not chosen. My hand, shaking so violently that the keys on my belt jingled. It reached for the drawer of the toll machine. I pulled it open. The empty metal tray seemed to mock me. What was I supposed to give in return? The figure remained utterly still, its hand extended. The coin offered. The pressure in the booth was immense, a physical and psychological force that was crushing my will. It wanted me to complete the ritual. I looked past the figure. Out onto the bridge, a new set of headlights had appeared, waiting patiently in the fog. But this time, I could see more. I could see the vague outlines of a dozen other cars behind it, their dim lights stretching back into the mist. They were all waiting for me. I looked back at the coin. My hand, as if guided by a force outside myself, moved forward through the impossible hole in the glass, my trembling fingers hovering just above the dark, tarnished metal. I had to take it. To refuse was to break a rule far older and more important than any my employers had written. I had to pay the toll, or become it. My fingers closed around the coin. It was as cold as a shard of ice from the bottom of the sea. The instant my skin broke contact with the gloved hand, the world snapped back. The oppressive cold vanished from the booth, replaced by the familiar, damp chill of the sea air. The impossible hole in the window sealed itself with a faint, shimmering ripple, becoming solid, condensation-beaded glass once more. The low hum of the fluorescent light flickered back to life above me with a reassuring buzz, its pale yellow glow a shield against the gloom. Outside, the figure in the long, dark coat was gone, dissolved back into the fog as if it had never been. The waiting headlights had vanished. The bridge was empty. I was alone again. My hand was clenched in a fist so tight my knuckles were white. The coin was still there, its profound cold a searing point of reality in my palm. I forced my fingers to uncurl. It lay on my skin, a disc of dark, pitted metal, heavier than it looked. On one side was the image of a skeletal, bridge-like structure, and on the other, a single, ornate bell. It was a token, a marker, not currency. My heart was a frantic, wild bird beating against the cage of my ribs, but the immediate, supernatural threat was gone. The silence was no longer a weapon. It was just silence. I was breathing again, ragged, heaving gasps that fogged up the newly reformed window. I stumbled back into my chair, the coin clutched in my hand, my mind a whirlwind of denial. A dream. It had to be a waking nightmare, a powerful hallucination brought on by sleep deprivation and the hypnotic monotony of the fog. The coin. A piece of pocket junk I'd forgotten about. Its chill, just the ambient temperature of the night. The figure, the vanishing cars, the dissolving glass. They were all phantoms of a tired mind. The explanation was flimsy, a threadbare blanket against a hurricane of impossibility. But it was all I had. I clung to it. I needed proof of reality. I reached for the radio, my hand shaking, and twisted the knob. Static crackled from the speaker. A harsh, ugly, beautiful sound. Then, a voice, faint and laced with interference, drifted through a late-night talk show host discussing something utterly mundane. It was the most wonderful sound I had ever heard. The world was still there. It hadn't been erased. The phantom procession was over. I had survived. A giddy, hysterical wave of relief washed over me. I had been tested by the night, by the fog, by my own sanity, and I had passed. I dropped the strange coin into an empty coffee mug on my desk. The clatter of it hitting the ceramic a satisfyingly solid, normal sound. I was done with it, a relic of a bad dream. For the next hour, everything was blessedly normal. The fog even seemed to thin a little. Then, real headlights appeared at the end of the bridge. A lorry, its powerful diesel engine, a reassuring, noisy rumble that grew steadily louder. It was the sound of commerce, of logistics, of the real, tangible world. I straightened up, ready for the simple, familiar transaction. As the lorry pulled up, its air brakes hissing, I slid my window open. The driver, a large man with a weary face, handed me the required toll. The exchange was normal, mundane, but as I took the money from him, I heard it, faint, almost imperceptible. Hidden beneath the throaty idle of the engine was another sound, a tiny, clear, metallic chime. It was the exact tone of the bell from my nightmare. I froze, the driver's change in my hand. He looked at me, his expression shifting from tired to impatient. "Everything all right, mate?" he asked. I shook my head, forcing a smile. "Fine. Long night." I gave him his change, and he drove off. The sound of his engine fading into the fog, but I could still hear it. A ghostly echo of a single, chiming bell woven into the noise of his departure. It wasn't the fog that played tricks with sound. It was the bridge. Or maybe it was me. Every car that followed was the same. A family saloon, a delivery van, a young couple in a sports car. Beneath the unique sound of each engine, I could now hear it clearly, a faint, resonant chime, a secret frequency only I seemed attuned to. The coin in the coffee mug began to vibrate, a low, barely audible hum that pulsed in time with my own quickening heartbeat. I hadn't survived the phenomenon. I had been recruited by it. The transaction with the phantom collector hadn't been a test. I passed. It was a job interview. And the coin wasn't a souvenir. It was my new equipment. I was still the toll collector. But my job was no longer just about the living. The bridge had two kinds of traffic. And now, I was responsible for both. The illusion of normalcy was a fragile sheet of ice, and it was cracking fast. The coin in the coffee mug was no longer just vibrating. It was emitting a high-frequency hum, a sound that drilled directly into the base of my skull. It was an amplifier, a beacon, and it was calling out to the silent, waiting dark. The fog, which had briefly thinned, came flooding back in, not as a gentle mist, but as a solid, rolling wall of white that slammed against my booth, cutting me off from the world entirely. The faint, ghostly chimes that accompanied the real cars were gone. They were replaced by a single, deafening bell that was no longer outside, but inside my head, a constant, piercing clang that synchronized with the throbbing of the coin. It was the sound of my own damnation. A real car was approaching, a terrified driver trying to navigate the sudden, blinding fog. I could hear his horn, a frantic, bleating sound of panic. But as he drew near my booth, the sound of his engine faltered, choked, and died. His headlights flickered and then transformed, shifting from modern white LEDs to the dim, sickly yellow of the phantom vehicles. The car glided past my window in absolute silence and dissolved into the mist. The last vestige of the real world had just been consumed. There was no longer a line between the two kinds of traffic. There was only the bridge. Then they came. Not just one, From out of the suffocating fog, a dozen of the tall, dark figures emerged. They moved with the same slow, Passian, deliberate tread, their footsteps a chorus of wet, crunching gravel that came from all sides. They surrounded my small glass box, their featureless faces turned towards me, a silent, judging committee. They raised their gloved hands in perfect unison and pressed them against the glass of my booth. Not just the window, but every pane, a network of frost, black and necrotic, instantly spread from their fingertips, covering the glass in a web of frozen darkness. The temperature inside the booth plunged, my breath pluming in front of my face. The light above me didn't just flicker. It exploded in a shower of sparks, plunging me into a near-total darkness lit only by the faint, ambient glow of the fog. They were here to claim me. This was not a job. It was an indenture. The booth was not a workplace. It was a cage, and my shift was eternal. The sound was the true assault, the clanging bell in my skull, the crunch of their endless, patient footsteps, and a new sound, the low, silent roar of 100 phantom engines, a sound I felt as a vibration in my bones rather than a noise in my ears. It was a symphony of dread designed to scour my sanity away, to hollow me out and leave nothing but a loyal gatekeeper. I would not let it happen. I was not one of them. Not yet. My body moved, fueled by a terror so pure it became a kind of strength. I snatched the coffee mug, the coin inside it now humming so loudly the ceramic was hot to the touch. I didn't know why I took it, only that I could not leave it behind. It was their link to me, and I would not give it back. I kicked the door of the booth open, the metal screaming in protest, and threw myself out into the fog and the cold and the circle of silent, waiting figures. I didn't look at them. I couldn't. I just ran. The bridge was a gauntlet. The fog was a living thing, its tendrils wrapping around my ankles, its dampness clinging to me like a shroud. The figures did not pursue me with speed, but their presence was everywhere. A dark, gloved hand would emerge from the mist to my right, and I would swerve left. The crunch of footsteps would sound directly in front of me, and I would veer away, my feet slipping on the wet asphalt. Phantom cars materialized out of the fog, their silent grills aimed directly at me, forcing me to dodge and weave between their ghostly fenders. The great steel arches of the bridge seemed to groan above me, the sound of stressed metal, a deep bass note beneath the piercing clang of the bell in my own head. My lungs burned. My legs were screaming. But the end of the bridge, the point where the road met the solid land, was a faint promise in the gloom. I could see the small, dark shape of the maintenance scooter Id, ridden here an eternity ago. It was salvation. I pushed harder. A final, desperate burst of speed. The sounds behind me, the phantom engines and the crunching footsteps, began to coalesce into a single, enraged roar of sound, a wave of pure psychic pressure meant to crush me. I reached the end of the bridge and threw myself onto the scooter, my fumbling hands finding the keys. I twisted the ignition. The scooter's small engine sputtered to life, a real, loud, gloriously imperfect sound of sputtering combustion. It was an act of defiance, a note of chaos in their silent, ordered world. I twisted the throttle and the scooter shot forward, away from the bridge, away from the fog. I risked a single glance over my shoulder. The entire bridge was now being consumed by a roiling, unnatural bank of fog, a living storm cloud from which the tall, dark shapes of the collectors watched me go. I had escaped their domain. I was back in the world of the living, but as I sped into the night, the hot, humming coin in my jacket pocket felt less like a stolen artifact and more like an anchor, its chain stretching all the way back to the haunted, waiting bridge. I didn't stop driving until the scooter's tiny engine was sputtering on its last fumes, and the grey light of dawn was bruising the eastern sky. I was miles inland, parked at the edge of a sleeping town. The air was cool and smelled of damp fields, a world away from the salt and fog of the coast. The bridge was a bad dream, a memory I could already feel my mind trying to bury. The humming in my jacket pocket had stopped. Cautiously, I pulled out the coin. It was inert, its deep, unnatural cold having faded to the simple coolness of metal. It was just a token now, a bizarre keepsake. I had done it. I had quit the strangest, the most terrifying job in the world. My relief was so profound it felt like a physical lightness. The world was blessedly noisy. A dawn chorus of birds was starting up in the trees, and in the distance, I could hear the rumble of the day's first train. It was the sound of a world that was solid, real, and blessedly free of ghosts. I felt a hysterical laugh bubble up in my chest. I was free. I dropped the coin back into my pocket, intending to throw it into the first river I crossed. As the train grew closer, its rhythmic clack-clack-clack on the rails became the dominant sound. It was a comforting, industrial heartbeat. But as I listened, a new sound began to weave itself into the familiar rhythm. It was a faint, metallic overtone, a single, clear note that rang in perfect time with the turning of the wheels. Clack chime, clack chime, clack chime. It was the bell. My blood ran cold. It wasn't just in my head anymore. The sound was real, impossibly embedded in the noise of the train. I fumbled in my pocket for the coin. It was no longer cool and inert. A faint, steady pulse of warmth was emanating from it, and it was vibrating softly in time with the distant, chiming train. I hadn't escaped with their anchor. They had given it to me. I wasn't the keeper of the bridge's toll anymore. I was a mobile collection agent, and my territory was now the entire, unsuspecting world down here, 2 miles beneath the surface. The only sounds you should hear are your own. My world is a small, bright bubble of light in an endless, crushing black. I'm a saturation diver, a deep-sea welder, and my current office is the abyssal plain of the Atlantic. The soundscape is intimate and mechanical. The slow, rhythmic hiss of the regulator feeding me my breathing mix. The steady thrum of the circulation pumps in my helmet. And the loud, violent crackle of my welding torch as it bites into the steel casing of a transatlantic data cable. These are the sounds of life, the noises that keep the immense, silent pressure at bay. They are predictable, constant, and mine. That's why the new sound was so wrong. It wasn't mechanical. It came from outside, a deep, resonant pulse that traveled through the water and vibrated in my bones. It was slow, like a colossal heartbeat, and it seemed to come not from one direction, but from the entire, surrounding void. It was the sound of something impossibly big, waking up in the dark. My torch sputtered out, the sudden silence amplifying the slow, powerful pulse. Thump. T-sat. Thump. It was a sound so low it was more a feeling than a noise, a pressure wave that vibrated through the water. through my suit and into the marrow of my bones. My first thought was geological, a seismic tremor, a pocket of gas escaping a deep-sea vent. It was a plausible, scientific explanation. The abyssal plane was not a static environment. I keyed the comms switch in my helmet. Topside. This is Alpha. Do you copy? Static answered. A harsh, impenetrable hiss. Comms were down. That was unusual. The umbilical that fed me my life and my connection to the world was a marvel of redundant systems. Topside. Comms check. Over. Nothing but the sound of an empty channel. The pulse continued its slow, inexorable rhythm, a deep, planetary heartbeat in the absolute dark. I tried to reignite my torch. The igniter clicked uselessly. No spark. I checked the gas flow meters displayed on my wrist-mounted panel. Everything was green. Full tanks. Perfect pressure. The equipment wasn't failing. Something was interfering with it. The pulse was more than just a sound. It was an energy field, a wave of force strong enough to disrupt sophisticated electronics. The thought sent a chill through me that had nothing to do with the near-freezing water. I pushed myself away from the data cable, my boots sinking into the fine, ancient silt, and floated a few feet above the seabed. I was a tiny, fragile speck of light in a universe of black. The pulse was all-encompassing, its source impossible to locate. It felt like it was coming from everywhere at once. I told myself to remain calm, to follow procedure, run diagnostics, attempt to reboot the comms, and wait for the anomaly to pass. The job was dangerous, and I was trained for contingencies. This was just a new one. But as I floated there, trying to wrestle my rising fear back into a professional box, I noticed something else. The silt on the ocean floor, which should have been still, was moving. With every deep, resonant thump of the pulse, the fine, grey dust would rise in a gentle, swirling cloud, dance in the water for a moment, and then slowly settle again, forming a pattern. It wasn't a random disturbance. It was a vast, intricate, geometric pattern being drawn on the seabed, a delicate mandala of swirling silt that stretched out from the data cable further than my lights could penetrate. The pulse wasn't a natural phenomenon. It was a deliberate act, and it was creating something. The methodical, silent artistry on the seafloor was more terrifying than any sound. This was not chaos. It was control. It was intelligence. The pulse, the deep, resonant thrum that vibrated through my very soul, was the sound of a will being exerted upon the world. It was a broadcast, and the seabed was its canvas. My professional training was a useless shield against the sheer, cosmic wrongness of it all. I was a trespasser, a microbe crawling on a vast, sleeping God, and I had, with my bright light and my violent, crackling torch, finally woken it up. The pulse began to change. The slow, steady rhythm, the 1-second beat of a sleeping heart, began to accelerate. Thump, 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 thump. It was the sound of something rousing itself from an eons-long slumber. With the quicker tempo, a new layer of sound was born within it, a low, grinding undertone, like continents shifting deep within the planet's crust. It was the sound of immense, geological-scale muscles contracting, of a body so vast its movements were seismic events. Then, my own sounds began to die. It started with the hiss of my regulator. It didn't stop, but it was corrupted. The steady, life-giving flow of air was now punctuated by moments of dead silence that were perfectly in sync with the pulse. Thump, hiss, thump is less than silence is greater than thump, hiss. My breath was being stolen, meted out by the entity in the dark. A cold, liquid panic began to flood my veins. The thrum of the circulation pumps in my helmet, my last bastion of mechanical comfort, began to sputter and fail. The small electric motors struggling against an invisible magnetic force that was choking them. The pulse was no longer just a sound wave, it was an electromagnetic weapon, and it was systematically dismantling my life support, stripping me of my own sounds and replacing them with its own. My world was shrinking, the familiar mechanical noises of my survival being consumed by this single, all-powerful rhythm. All that was left was the sound of my own frantic heartbeat, a wild, panicked drum against the slow, majestic beat of the Leviathan. But then, it took that from me, too. The pulse shifted its rhythm again, the massive, external beat, locking onto my tiny, internal one, mimicking it with a horrifying, perfect precision. My terror, my adrenaline, my biological response to fear was now the metronome for a creature the size of a mountain. It was listening to me. It was feeling me. It was inside my suit, inside my head, a connection that was a profound and absolute violation. The geometric patterns in the silt began to churn, the delicate mandala dissolving into a chaotic, swirling cloud as the pulse reached its crescendo. This was no longer a display of art. It was a show of power. The grinding sound intensified, becoming a dominant, physical vibration that I could feel through the thick soles of my boots. It was the sound of movement. The entity was no longer just a sound. It was a physical presence, and it was now moving through the crushing, absolute dark. The data cable, the very reason I was down here, began to vibrate, a low, resonant hum that harmonized with the external pulse. It was a tuning fork, and the entity was striking it. I realized then that the cable's electromagnetic field, a tiny spark of human energy in this vast wilderness, was what had drawn its attention. My torch had been the final insult, a painfully bright and loud irritant. I was a flea on its skin, and it was finally coming to scratch. The pulse stopped. The silence that followed was a physical blow, a sudden, crushing void. But it was not empty. From the absolute darkness, just beyond the reach of my helmet lights, came a new sound, a slow, deliberate, grinding scrape, the sound of a mountain being dragged across the floor of the sea, and it was getting closer. The scraping sound was the noise of a world being remade. It was a slow, inexorable grinding that vibrated up from the seabed, a noise so profound it seemed to have texture, like a file being dragged across the bones of the planet. My helmet lights, which could cut through a quarter-mile of the clearest water, now seemed to penetrate only a few feet before the darkness swallowed them. The water grew cloudy, not with silt, but with something else, a particulate shadow that was being shed from the approaching mass. And then I saw it, or rather, I saw a part of it. My lights, at their maximum intensity, struck a surface. It was not a rock formation. It was a wall of non-blackness, a vertical cliff face of a color my brain refused to pass, a deep, bruised purple laced with veins of what looked like bioluminescent gold. It was a texture like flesh, like granite, and it rose up from the seafloor and continued into the crushing dark above me, beyond the reach of my lights. It was a moving mountain range. I was not looking at a creature. I was looking at a tiny, insignificant patch of its skin. The grinding sound was the noise of this living continent dragging its flank across the abyssal plain. The sheer, mind-breaking scale of it was a physical blow. All the life I had ever known could fit into a single pore on this thing's hide. It was not hostile. It was not even aware of me. I was a mote of dust on its path, a triviality. The realization was a cold, clean terror that cut through my panic, leaving a state of pure, adrenaline-fueled awe. The great wall of its body was moving towards the transatlantic cable, the thin, pathetic silver line that was my reason for being here. It was drawn to it, to the faint, anomalous pulse of electricity and light so far from the sun. A shadow fell over me, a darkness that eclipsed the already absolute black. Something was descending from above. It was not a tentacle. It was too large, too slow. It was a limb so vast it had its own gravitational pull, and it was reaching for the cable with a ponderous, almost gentle curiosity. As the limb descended, the water around me began to move, caught in the downdraft of its passage. I was pulled upwards, a helpless toy in its wake. My suits, systems, which had been failing, suddenly screamed back to life in a chaotic cacophony. The pumps in my helmet whirred at a frantic, impossible speed. My comms exploded with a sound that was not static, but a roar of biological energy, a sound like a solar flare and a whale song combined, fired directly into my ears. The entity was so saturated with bioelectricity that its mere proximity was overloading every system I had. The colossal, the shadowy limb finally made contact with the cable. It did not break it. It simply touched it. The moment it did, a wave of pure, white energy erupted from the point of contact. The transatlantic cable, carrying the data of a whole world, discharged its entire energy load into the creature in a single, silent, brilliant flash. The flash was a physical force. The shockwave hit me like a solid object, a hammer blow of pure pressure that bypassed my suit's armor and slammed into my very core. My connection to the world, the umbilical that supplied my air and my data, was ripped from its housing on my suit with a violent shriek of tearing metal. I was untethered. The blast threw me backwards, tumbling end over end through the crushing, silent dark. For a single, illuminated second, I saw the true scale of the thing I had disturbed. My uncontrolled spin oriented me so that my lights briefly painted a picture of it, a landscape of impossible, living anatomy that filled my entire field of vision. It was not a creature in the ocean. It was a living ocean unto itself. Then the darkness took me completely. I was alone, untethered, and falling through an endless, living night. I had been swatted away like an insect, a momentary annoyance. I was, for the briefest of moments, free. I was a ghost in a dead universe, tumbling through the endless, crushing black, untethered and blind. The shockwave had knocked out my helmet lights, and my suit was a coffin of profound darkness. The only sounds were my own ragged, panicked breaths and the frantic useless beeping of a dozen error alarms. But I was alive. The realization came slowly, a single, flickering candle in the hurricane of my terror. The creature, the living continent, was gone. The pulse, the grinding, the overwhelming presence, all of it had vanished. The silence of the abyss had returned, and it was no longer a weapon, but a shield. I was alone, And in that moment, being alone was the most profound and comforting state I could imagine. My training, buried under a mountain of primal fear, began to resurface. The suit had its own independent emergency systems. I fumbled with the manual controls on my chest plate, my gloved fingers clumsy and numb. I managed to reboot the primary O2 scrubber. The frantic beeping of the alarms ceased, replaced by the soft, steady hiss of my own life support. It was a sound of sublime, mechanical beauty. I was breathing. I had 20 minutes of emergency air. A death sentence, but a reprieve nonetheless. Then, another system came online, the distress beacon. A faint, high-pitched ping, once every 10 seconds, radiated out from my suit. It was a tiny, hopeful voice shouting into an infinite, empty cathedral. But it was a voice, a chance. I had survived. I had witnessed something that would shatter the foundations of biology, of science itself, and I had survived. The relief was a physical thing, a warmth that spread through my limbs, pushing back the deep-sea cold. I was a survivor. The story I would tell. If they found me, if the 10-second silences between the pings of my beacon were absolute, a perfect, profound void. It was in one of these silences that I first heard it. A faint, low-frequency hum, so subtle I thought it was the vibration of my own shivering, but it came again in the next silence. It wasn't a hum, it was a pulse, a slow, deep, rhythmic thrum that was a perfect, miniature echo of the Leviathan's heartbeat. My blood ran cold. It was impossible. I was miles away from the creature now, a speck of dust falling through the void. It couldn't be an external sound. It had to be a malfunction. My suit's audio processors damaged by the blast, replaying the last dominant sound they had registered. A phantom echo, a neurological ghost. That had to be it. I tried to ignore it, to focus on the hopeful sound of the beacon's ping. Ping, thump thump, ping, thump thump. But the internal pulse was growing stronger, clearer. It wasn't just a sound in my helmet speakers anymore. I could feel it. A deep, resonant vibration was running through the very frame of my suit. The metal was resonating with the memory of that colossal energy. The horrible realization dawned on me. A new, cold sun in my dark little universe. The energy blast from the cable hadn't just thrown me clear. It had been a carrier wave. The creature had touched the combined data stream of a whole planet, and the resulting discharge had shot a fragment of that consciousness, that energy, that sound, directly into me. My suit, my electronics, my own body, had been saturated with it. The distress beacon pinged again, a sharp, clear signal, and this time the pulse answered it. The deep thump-thump followed the ping perfectly, a call and a response. I wasn't sending out a distress signal, I was a relay. My suit, my existence, was now a beacon, but it wasn't calling for rescue. It was broadcasting a signal of a different kind, a homing beacon that was a perfect copy of the creature's own song. I hadn't escaped the abyss. I had become its newest, smallest, and most mobile voice. And, in the crushing, silent, dark, I had a terrible feeling that something, somewhere, was now listening. The suit was no longer a shell. It was a bell, and I was the clapper. Every 10 seconds, my beacon would cry out for help, and the abyssal pulse would answer. turning my plea for rescue into a monstrous siren song. The silence of the deep was no longer a comfort. It was a listening ear, and something was stirring in the dark. It started as a flicker of movement at the very edge of my restored, but still weak, helmet lights. A pale, sinuous shape that darted into view and then vanished. Then another, from a different direction. They were scavengers, the ghouls of the abyss, drawn not by the promise of a meal, but by the commanding, irresistible pulse my suit was now emitting. They were not large, no bigger than a man, but they were things of nightmare, all needle-like teeth, blind, milky eyes, and long, whip-like bodies. They didn't attack. They began to circle me, a growing gyre of pale, ghostly shapes in the absolute black, their movements perfectly synchronized to the thump-thump of the pulse. They were a congregation, and I was the unwilling sermon. The pulse was no longer just a sound in my helmet and a vibration in the suit's frame. It was becoming a part of me. I could feel it in my teeth, in the fluid of my inner ear. A wave of nauseating vertigo washed over me as my own sense of rhythm, my own internal clock, began to lock onto the alien beat. It was a hostile takeover of my very nervous system. I had to stop the broadcast. I had to get away. My only hope was up. 2 miles of crushing, black water separated me from the sun, but it was the only direction that mattered. I slammed my gloved hand onto the control panel on my chest, overriding the safety protocols and activating the suit's emergency ascent thrusters. The reaction was instantaneous and violent. A blast of compressed gas erupted from the pack on my back. A beautiful, profane roar of real, mechanical noise that momentarily scattered the circling creatures. I was rocketing upwards, a tiny, screaming projectile aimed at a sky I couldn't see. The ascent was brutal. The change in pressure was agonizing, my body screaming in protest, the suit groaning around me as it struggled to compensate. But the physical pain was a welcome distraction from the insidious, psychological assault of the pulse. As I rose, the school of abyssal scavengers followed, a comet's tail of pale, hungry ghosts drawn by my signal. They were faster in their element, and they began to close in, their blind eyes fixed on the source of the sound. One of them, a long, eel-like horror, lunged, its jaw unhinging. I twisted my body, firing a lateral thruster, and the creature shot past, its sandpaper rough skin scraping against my helmet with a sound like tearing rock. The pulse was fighting me. As I ascended, its rhythm became more complex, more disorienting, a cacophony of deep bass notes designed to induce vertigo and panic. It was trying to make me lose control, to stop my frantic flight. My vision began to swim, the darkness in front of me filled with the phantom after images of the Leviathan's impossible geometry. It was showing me things, trying to break my mind. I screamed into my helmet, a raw, animal sound of defiance, focusing on the one thing that mattered, the depth gauge on my wrist. 1, 5 miles. 1, 2 miles. 1 mile. I was a rising bubble in an infinite ocean, and the monsters were still behind me. I had one last, desperate idea. I couldn't stop the pulse, but maybe I could mask it. I accessed the suit's external speaker system, the one used for underwater communication, and broadcast the only other sound I had, the piercing, high-frequency shriek of my own distress beacon, amplified to its maximum, bone-jarring volume. The water around me exploded in a wave of pure, painful noise. The effect on the creatures was immediate. Their synchronized, hypnotic dance was shattered. The pure, chaotic noise of the beacon was anathema to the ordered, rhythmic pulse they were following. They writhed and convulsed, disoriented by the conflicting signals, and scattered back into the darkness. I had bought myself a reprieve. The last mile of my ascent was a blur of pain, noise, and the deep, thrumming pulse that was now a permanent part of my consciousness. I didn't care. I was rising. The crushing black began to soften, shifting to a deep, bruised purple, then to a murky, slate grey. I could see the light. I broke the surface in a chaotic explosion of foam and spray. The sudden, glorious light of the afternoon sun was a physical blow, a radiant, blinding pain that was the most beautiful thing I had ever experienced. I was floating in a vast, empty expanse of choppy, sun-drenched water. The sky above was a perfect, impossible blue. The horrors of the deep were below me, banished by the light. I had made it. I was on the surface. I was alive. I was floating in the warm, familiar world of the sun, but even with the sound of the wind and the waves crashing around my helmet, I could still hear it. A faint, deep, and patient thump-thump, no longer a vibration in my suit, but a steady, rhythmic pulse in my own blood. I floated under the glorious, open sky, a man reborn. My rescue beacon was still pinging, a lonely but hopeful sound that carried for miles over the sunlit waves. The internal pulse was still there, a deep and steady beat in my blood, a permanent souvenir from the abyss. But out here, in the world of light and air, it felt muted, a ghost in my veins that could be ignored. It was the price of survival, a scar I would carry. I could live with that. After an hour that felt like a lifetime, I heard a new sound, carried on the wind. It was a song, a deep, resonant, and beautiful chorus of moans and clicks that was unmistakably the sound of whales. Hope, pure and overwhelming, surged through me. They were close. A rescue ship would be tracking them. They would see me. I was saved. The song grew louder, closer. A pod of them. It sounded like their calls a complex and soothing symphony. I listened, a delirious smile on my face. The sound, a balm on my shattered nerves. But as I focused, a cold thread of familiarity began to weave its way through the beauty of the song. The rhythm, the deep, resonant moans that formed the bass notes of their calls. They were spaced perfectly, deliberately. There was a slow, majestic, 1 second interval between each one. Thump, pause, thump. It was the pulse. My blood turned to ice. It wasn't just a similar rhythm. It was the exact same biological, resonant frequency that had vibrated through the deep. The whales were not just singing, they were broadcasting. The clicks and whistles were just decoration, a natural camouflage for the true signal that lay beneath. My own internal pulse, the one in my blood, suddenly felt stronger, a tiny drum beating in perfect, terrifying synchronicity with the approaching pod. I wasn't a survivor waiting for rescue. I was a lost nerve cell, and I had just called out to the rest of the nervous system. The beautiful, hopeful song of the whales was the sound of the abyss, rising to the surface to welcome me home. My job is to capture the sound of nothing. The anechoic chamber is a holy place for an audio engineer, a dead space scientifically designed to strangle sound at birth. The air is thick, heavy, and the silence is a physical pressure on my eardrums. My world is the faint hiss of my high-sensitivity microphone and the internal, biological noises of my own body, the soft rush of my own breathing, the slow, dull thud of my own pulse, a familiar, muffled drum in my ears. I am here to record the certified, absolute silence of this decommissioned university lab. My equipment was running, my meters were flatlined, everything was perfect. But then, a new sound began. It wasn't an echo or a vibration from outside. It was a clean, clear audio signal picked up by my microphone from the center of the room. It was a heartbeat. It was slow, steady, and deep, and it was not mine. It was a perfect, rhythmic beat in a place where the only sound should have been the sound of my own blood. My own heart gave a frantic, a startled leap in my chest. A sudden, fast drumbeat of adrenaline. I immediately ripped the headphones from my ears. The silence of the chamber rushed in, a thick, smothering blanket. It was absolute. No heartbeat, no sound. There was only the low, internal thrum of my own blood pressure, a sound I knew intimately, the sound I had been paid to isolate from this recording. I slipped the headphones back on. The phantom heartbeat was still there, a slow, deep, and steady thump-thump in the microphone feed, completely out of sync with my own panicked, rabbit-quick pulse. My professional training kicked in, a welcome bulwark against the rising tide of unease. My first thought was equipment malfunction, a feedback loop, an electrical anomaly in the microphone's high-gain preamp, something that was creating a rhythmic, low-frequency oscillation. It was rare, but not impossible. I muted the microphone. The phantom heartbeat vanished. I unmuted it. The sound returned. A slow, patient, and impossibly clean signal. It was no malfunction. The microphone was doing its job perfectly. It was capturing a sound that was present in the deadest acoustic space on campus. I pressed my fingers to the pulse point on my neck. My own heart was beating at a frantic 100 beats per minute. The sound in my headphones was a slow, deliberate 60. They were two entirely different rhythms. A frantic drum solo laid over a slow, majestic bass line. They were not connected. This was not an auditory hallucination. The chamber playing tricks on my mind. My equipment was giving me objective, undeniable data. A real sound was being generated in this room. But from what? The chamber was a suspended box within a larger room, resting on massive springs to dampen any vibration from the outside world. The walls were lined with huge, sound-absorbing fiberglass wedges, meters deep. Nothing got in, nothing got out. It was the tomb of sound. I tried to rationalize it. A seismic tremor too low for me to feel. A resonance from the building's deep foundation. It was a stretch, a desperate grasp for a branch of logic in a place that seemed to be defying the laws of physics. I tried to continue my work, to log the recording and ignore the intrusive beat. I told myself I would simply filter it out in post-production, but the sound was a constant, hypnotic presence. The room felt the same, still, heavy and silent. Yet the atmosphere had been poisoned. The silence was no longer empty. It was occupied. It was listening. And the slow, steady heartbeat that was not mine continued its patient, eternal rhythm, a quiet declaration that I was not and had never been. alone in this room. This was no longer a passive phenomenon. The slow, steady heartbeat was not just a signal, it was an anchor, and something was pulling itself into existence through it. The sound in my headphones began to change, to deepen. It was no longer a simple low-frequency thump. It was becoming richer, more detailed, more horribly organic. I could now hear the wet, valvular click that followed each beat, the sound of an immense, unseen valve closing in the dark. It was the sound of a living, functioning heart, and its fidelity was growing with every passing second, as if the microphone was slowly zooming in on a monstrous anatomy. The sound was a predator, and it was stalking the silence. Then, the true violation began. My own sounds, the ones that proved my own existence in this void, began to disappear from the recording. I watched the audio waveform on my laptop, which showed the sharp, frantic peaks of my own accelerated pulse. But in my headphones, listening to the live feed from the microphone, I could no longer hear it. My own heartbeat, a sound I had taken for granted, had been completely and perfectly cancelled out, erased from the audio spectrum by the dominant, alien rhythm. The phantom beat was the only one that the microphone acknowledged now. It was the only pulse that mattered in this room. My panic intensified, and I took a deep, shuddering breath. A sound that should have been a loud rush of air in the sensitive microphone. But there was nothing, only silence, punctuated by the slow, steady thump, click of the other heart. I tried again, a forced, ragged gasp. The microphone registered nothing. I did not exist. In the objective, unforgiving ear of my own equipment, I was becoming a ghost. The machine I trusted to capture reality was now presenting me with an alternate one, a reality in which I was silent and fading, while this other entity was becoming more and more solid. The silence was no longer empty. It was being actively curated. The chamber wasn't just a dead space. It was a blank canvas, and this thing was painting itself into existence with sound, while methodically erasing me from the picture. My professional detachment was gone, burned away by a cold, existential terror. This wasn't a haunting, an echo of a past event. This was a birth, the anechoic chamber, designed to kill every echo, every stray vibration, had created the perfect, sterile womb for a creature made of pure, original sound to grow. It had no competition. It had no reflection. It was the only real thing in the room. The heartbeat was then joined by a new sound. It was a faint, slow whisper of air, a sound like a vast pair of lungs inhaling and exhaling in perfect time with the alien pulse. Thump-click, a slow, whispering breath in. Thump-click, a long, rattling breath out. The sound was constructing a body for itself, piece by piece, in the sterile dark. First a heart, now the breath. I was no longer just an observer. I was a witness to a creation, and the chilling certainty settled in my soul that once its sonic form was complete, it would need a physical one to inhabit. The heavy, insulated door was my only way out, but the slow, the patient rhythm of the breathing in my ears seemed to whisper a single, terrifying promise: you are not going anywhere. The heavy, the insulated door of the anechoic chamber was my only path back to reality, a solid, tangible object in a world that was dissolving into a sonic nightmare. I had to get to it. I tore the headphones from my head, casting them aside as if they were venomous. I would not listen anymore. I would not be a witness to my own erasure. The thick, profound silence of the room rushed in, but it was no longer a comfort. It was the canvas upon which the creature was painting itself, and I could now feel its presence even without the microphone to translate it. A low, subsonic pressure was building in the room, a rhythmic pulse that matched the heartbeat I had been hearing. It was a pressure I felt in my sinuses, in my chest cavity, a physical assault of silent, low-frequency sound. The air was no longer still. It was moving, a slow, cold draft, smelling of ozone and the deep, sterile dust of the fiberglass wedges began to circle the room, a phantom breath that grew stronger with each pulse. I took a step towards the door, and the phenomenon reacted. The slow, pulsing pressure in the room intensified into a solid, concussive blow. It was like being hit in the chest with a fist made of air. I staggered back, a grunt of pain forced from my lips. The sound of my own pained gasp was a small, defiant noise in the crushing silence, and the entity seemed to notice. The phantom breathing, which had been a slow, steady rhythm, hitched. It stopped. Then it focused, a single, powerful gust of chilling air, smelling of ancient, dead spaces, slammed into me from the center of the room, throwing me back against the sound-absorbing wedges. My head hit the soft, coarse material with a dull thud. The thing was no longer just forming. It was now a kinetic force. It was a poltergeist made of pure acoustics. Panic gave way to a desperate, primal need to fight. This was my space, my recording session. I was the one in control. I scrambled away from the wall, my eyes locked on the empty center of the room where the microphone stood, the focal point of this nightmare. The air shimmered there, a slight, almost imperceptible distortion, like heat haze on a summer road. It was the epicenter of the pressure, the heart of the sonic body it was building. I needed to create a sound it couldn't control, a chaotic, complex wave of noise that would disrupt its perfect fix. Sterile creation. My laptop. It sat on the small, isolated table next to my gear. I lunged for it, my hands closing around the smooth metal casing. The entity responded instantly. A blast of focused air, a silent roar, hit the table, sending my microphone and audio interface crashing to the floor. The sound of their impact was swallowed by the deadening walls, but I felt the vibration through the soles of my feet. It was protecting its anchor, its connection to this room. It was too late. I already had the laptop. I flipped it open, my fingers flying across the trackpad, not with any plan, but with the pure, instinctual need to make noise. I opened a music file. Anything. The first one my cursor found. It was a chaotic piece of classical music, a full orchestra erupting in a crescendo of strings, brass, and percussion. I cranked the volume to its maximum and pointed the laptop's small, tinny speakers towards the shimmering air in the center of the room. The first few notes, a blast of chaotic, complex sound, erupted into the chamber. For a glorious second, the pressure in the room vanished. The phantom breathing ceased. The heartbeat faltered. The complex, real-world sound was a poison to its pure, simple existence. It was working. But the creature learned fast. The music began to distort. The beautiful, chaotic symphony was deconstructed, its notes bent and twisted. The violins were stretched into a high-pitched, screaming whine. The brass section became a series of low, flatulent moans. The percussion was reduced to a dull, rhythmic thud that was horribly, sickeningly, familiar. It was consuming the music, digesting it, and turning it into a grotesque mimicry of its own emerging body. It was feeding. I slammed the laptop shut, the distorted music cutting off abruptly. I had only made it stronger. My one weapon had become its food. There was only one option left: the door. I threw the laptop aside and scrambled for the exit, a 4-foot-thick marvel of acoustic engineering. I grabbed the heavy, industrial lever, my fingers numb with cold and fear. The entity knew what I was about to do. A final, furious blast of pressure, a silent, concussive roar, slammed into my back, trying to force me into the room. I held on, my muscles screaming, and threw my entire body weight downwards on the lever. The locking pins began to retract with a series of loud, mechanical clunks. Real, beautiful, complex sounds. Each one was a physical blow to the creature. The pressure on my back faltered. The phantom heartbeat in my bones stuttered, losing its rhythm. I was fighting back with the sound of the world itself. The door was my salvation, and the sound of its opening was my sword. The heavy door swung shut behind me with a solid, definitive thump, and the bolt slid home with a final, beautiful click. The sounds were a symphony. I was standing in the observation corridor, a dimly lit hallway that encircled the suspended chamber. The air was cool and tasted of old concrete and dust, the real, imperfect air of a normal building. I was out. Leaning my full weight against the door, I slid to the floor, my body a trembling, exhausted mess. The silence was gone. My ears, so long deprived of normal input, were flooded with a beautiful, chaotic orchestra of mundane noise. There was the low, 60-cycle hum of the emergency lighting, the distant, asthmatic rumble of the building's main HVAC system, the faint squeak of my own jacket as I breathed. They were the sounds of reality, and I drank them in like a man dying of thirst. The events in the chamber already felt unreal, a fever dream receding in the light of these normal, predictable sounds. A hallucination, that's what it had to be. Prolonged sensory deprivation in an anechoic environment was known to cause auditory and even tactile hallucinations. My mind, starved of external stimuli, had simply created its own. The heartbeat was my own pulse, amplified and distorted by my subconscious. The pressure, the breath, all of it, just phantoms born of a perfect, scientific silence. I clung to this explanation, a life raft in a sea of madness. I was a scientist, an engineer. I believed in physics, in acoustics, not in monsters made of sound. I had simply had a panic attack in a very strange room. I stayed there for a long time, just listening. The building settled, a low groan of stressed concrete from deep within its foundations. A pipe ticked somewhere down the hall. My own breathing slowly returned to a steady, even rhythm. The terror began to fade, replaced by a deep, bone-weary exhaustion and a profound sense of embarrassment. I had let my imagination run away with me. I would pack up my damaged equipment, go home, and never speak of this. My job was to record silence, and that's what I would report. I had found. I pushed myself to my feet, my legs unsteady. I felt a sense of profound liberation. I had not escaped a monster, I had escaped the confines of my own fear. I began the slow walk down the corridor towards the main lab exit. The only light came from the emergency fixtures spaced every 20 feet, casting long, distorted shadows. It was in this quiet, echoing space that I began to notice it. A pattern. It was subtle, almost imperceptible. A quiet ordering of the ambient chaos. The low hum of the emergency light I was approaching seemed to flicker, almost imperceptibly, and the faint buzz it made had a slight, rhythmic pulse to it. Buzz, buzz, buzz. I stopped, listening. Further down the hall, a water pipe was dripping. A slow, steady plink, plink, plink. I timed it with my watch. Each drip was precisely 1 second apart. It was a perfect fen, metronomic 60 drips per minute. My blood ran cold, the fragile edifice of my rational explanation beginning to crumble. It was a coincidence. It had to be. But now that I was listening, I could hear it everywhere. The distant rumble of the HVAC system was no longer a constant drone. It was a low, resonant thrum, 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 each pulse a second apart. The building was no longer just making noise. It was keeping time. The sounds weren't a chaotic, natural symphony anymore. They were being conducted. My gaze was drawn to the observation window. The thick, laminated glass that looked into the dead, black heart of the anechoic chamber. I hadn't released myself from its prison. I had opened the door and let the prisoner out. The entity wasn't a ghost trapped in the silence. It was a consciousness, and the chamber was merely its ear. Now, for the first time, it was hearing the rich, complex, and chaotic soundscape of the world outside its womb. And it was learning. It was listening to the building, and the building was learning to sing its slow, simple, horrifying song. The heartbeat hadn't followed me out. It didn't need to. It was teaching the entire world to beat for it. The corridor was a resonant chamber, and I was the tuning fork. My fragile, rational explanation of a hallucination shattered into a million pieces, each one reflecting a new, horrifying truth. This was not a memory. This was a broadcast. The entity I had released from its silent prison was not just listening to the world, it was teaching it its song. The rhythmic humming of the lights grew louder, the 60-cycle buzz deepening into a hypnotic, throbbing drone that pulsed in time with the metronomic drip of the pipe down the hall. My teeth began to ache, a sympathetic vibration running through my jaw. The building was becoming a single, vast, and malevolent instrument, and every object within it was a string being tuned to the same simple, terrifying note. I had to get out. The main exit was 2 floors up, through a labyrinth of identical, sterile corridors. I broke into a run, my footsteps a chaotic, panicked rhythm that was a desperate protest against the building's encroaching order. The entity noticed. The moment I began to flee, the soundscape became a weapon. The deep, rhythmic thrum of the HVAC system intensified into a series of subsonic blows that hammered at my chest, stealing my breath. The fluorescent lights overhead began to flicker in perfect time with the pulse, no longer just a sound, but a strobing, disorienting attack on my vision that made the hallway seem to stretch and twist. Vertigo slammed into me, and I stumbled, catching myself against the cold, humming wall. Then came the fire alarm. A bell on the ceiling directly above me exploded into life, not with the frantic, chaotic clangor of a real emergency, but with a slow, deliberate, deafening toll. Clang, clang, clang. Each strike was a physical blow of sound, a sledgehammer of noise that reverberated through the concrete and steel, perfectly synchronized with the building's new, monstrous heartbeat. The pain was excruciating, a spike of pure sonic agony that drilled into my ears and rattled my skull. This was not a warning. It was an execution. It was the sound of my own funeral bell, and it was being rung just for me. I staggered on, my hands clamped over my ears, a useless gesture against a sound that was as much a vibration in my bones as it was a wave in the air. I reached the stairwell, the tolling bell chasing me down the corridor. I threw the heavy door open and started to climb, taking the concrete steps 2 at a time. The stairwell was an echo chamber, a vertical concrete throat that amplified the building's song into a deafening roar. Every pipe, every railing, every steel tread vibrated with the same perfect 1 second pulse. I was climbing through the belly of the beast. I burst out onto the ground floor, into the main lobby of the science building. It was a large, cavernous space with a high ceiling and a wall of glass doors that led to the night outside, to freedom. But the lobby was the heart of the symphony. The acoustics of the space turned the rhythmic noises from the building's guts into a focused, overwhelming force. The air itself was a thick, vibrating jelly of sound. The huge plate glass doors were visibly trembling in their frames, a low, resonant hum emanating from them as they struggled to contain the pressure. The entity was trying to turn the entire building into a new, larger chamber, with me trapped at its center. It was no longer just sound. A fine, grey dust, shaken loose from the ceiling by the intense vibrations, was dancing in the air, forming intricate, geometric patterns that swirled and resolved in time with the beat. It was the same phenomenon I had read about in old acoustic experiments. Chladni figures, but on an architectural scale. The building itself was a vast soundboard, and the entity was showing me the shape of its new voice. I was the last discordant element, the last chaotic variable that had to be silenced. I ran, my feet slapping on the polished linoleum floor, the sound of my own flight, a desperate, meaningless noise in the face of the overwhelming, ordered roar. The glass doors were 20 feet away. As I approached, the hum they were emitting rose in pitch, becoming a piercing, keening shriek. The entity was focusing its power, turning the last barrier into a final weapon. I didn't slow down. I threw my shoulder into the main door's panic bar, putting every ounce of my weight and my terror into it. The bar moved, but the door resisted, held shut by the rhythmic pressure of the sound waves pushing against it from inside. It was like trying to open a door against a hurricane. The whole building seemed to groan in protest, a deep, resonant note of fury at my attempt to break its perfect rhythm. I roared, a raw, wordless sound of defiance, and pushed again. For a heart-stopping second, nothing happened. Then, with a sound like a gunshot, the seal broke. The door flew open, and I was thrown out into the night, propelled by a final, furious wave of organized sound. I tumbled onto the dew-damp grass of the university quad, the chaotic, beautiful sounds of the night washing over me, the chirping of crickets, the distant drone of traffic, the rustle of wind in the trees. The building behind me fell silent. I had escaped. I was outside, in the messy, imperfect, gloriously chaotic real world. I had broken the symphony. I lay on the cool, damp grass of the quad, a refugee washed ashore on the beach of reality. The sounds of the night were a chaotic and beautiful symphony, a healing balm for my acoustically tortured soul. The random, asynchronous chirping of 1,000 crickets, the gentle, unpredictable rustle of the wind in the campus oaks, the distant, rumbling drone of traffic on the motorway. Each sound was a declaration of freedom, a testament to a world that was messy, complex, and gloriously out of sync. I had won. I had escaped the building, the source, the womb of that sonic entity. It was trapped back there, a king in a concrete castle, its influence ending at the walls. I closed my eyes, letting the sheer, wonderful messiness of the world's soundscape wash over me. I focused on the crickets, their frantic, individual chirps, a wall of beautiful, white noise. It was the sound of life, disorganized and free. But as I lay there, my highly trained ear began to pick something out of the chaos. A pattern. It was faint at first. A tiny cluster of chirps over to my left that seemed to be falling into a rhythm. A coincidence. Nothing more. But the cluster began to grow. More and more of the insects seemed to be abandoning their frantic, individual songs and joining the simple, emerging beat. The wall of chaotic noise was thinning, becoming clearer, more organized. My eyes snapped open, a cold dread washing away my relief. I sat up and listened, truly listened, with the horrified attention of a man who knew what he was hearing. The phenomenon was accelerating. Entire sections of the field were falling silent, only to rejoin the chorus in perfect, metronomic time. Within a minute, the transformation was complete. The sound of 1,000 individual crickets chirping randomly was gone. It had been replaced by a single, unified, and monstrously perfect sound. From every blade of grass, from every corner of the quad, every single cricket was now chirping in perfect, absolute synchronicity. A single, rhythmic, pulsing chirp that was exactly 1 second long, followed by exactly 1 second of perfect silence. It was the heartbeat. I hadn't let the entity out of the chamber. I had let it out of the building, and it was finding a whole new world of instruments to play.